Hello, my fellow story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. It was late in the evening when I first walked into the building. The kind of evening where the night feels like it's trying to swallow the day whole, just waiting for that last bit of light to fade completely. I've worked the night shift at the old hospital for a few weeks now. It wasn't a high-paying job, but it paid the bills, and that's all I really cared about back then. The kind of place you might not give a second thought to unless you had to be there after hours. This hospital had been around for decades, maybe even longer. It had seen its fair share of things: lives saved, lives lost. It was one of those buildings where the walls seemed to carry stories, not all of them pleasant. The doctors and nurses came and went, but I was one of the few faces that stayed, working the security desk in the lobby. It wasn't exactly a glamorous position, but I never had trouble with it. I spent most of my time reading, checking the cameras, and walking the empty hallways, the only sound being the hum of the fluorescent lights above. At least, that's how it was supposed to be. There were 3 of us who worked the night shift. The head of security, an older guy named Tom, was usually the first one to show up. He wasn't much of a talker, but he was solid, always had the place locked down tight. He'd hand me the keys to the main doors and head off to his corner of the building. Then there was Greg, a younger guy around my age. He had only been on the job for a few months, and he was still adjusting to the strange, quiet atmosphere of the hospital at night. And then there was me. I had been working the night shift for about 6 weeks, just long enough to get used to the routine, but not long enough to let the oddities of the place slide off my back. This particular hospital had a vibe. It was old. It had a sort of oppressive, lingering feeling about it, like it carried memories in its walls. The floors creaked, and the air always felt a little too heavy. But for the most part, the job was routine. Every night, after the last staff members left, I'd lock the doors, walk the halls a few times, check the cameras, and wait for the hours to pass. Nothing ever really happened, or so I thought. The night shifts were always slow, which was perfect for me. The night hours were peaceful, with no one around but the occasional late-night emergency. I would sit at the desk in the lobby, scrolling through my phone or reading old books I had found in the hospital's lost and found. The rest of the building was empty, save for the occasional nurse or doctor rushing through. They were never there for long, but long enough for me to exchange the usual pleasantries. One of the things I had grown used to was the silence. The building had its creaks and groans, but that was to be expected. Hospitals, especially older ones, are full of noises that don't seem to make sense, like the faint clatter of a cart rolling down the hallway or the sound of a door that hadn't been properly shut. It was a sound I had grown accustomed to, like background noise. I would tell myself it was just the building settling, the wind outside pushing at the old windows, making them groan and protest. But that night, things felt a little different. When the night began, everything seemed normal. I met up with Greg in the break room. He was munching on a sandwich, looking at his phone, the same way I was. "You ever get used to the silence?" he asked, breaking the quiet. I looked up from my book. "I don't know. I guess so. It's just part of the job. You learn to ignore it." "I don't know, man. Sometimes it feels like something's watching me. You know?" I couldn't help but laugh. "That's just the night shift messing with your head. It does that to everyone." "Yeah, well, it's different here. There's something about this place." He took another bite of his sandwich. It was one of those conversations that could go on forever if you let it. The one where you throw a little anxiety into the air, just to see if anyone else feels it too. But I didn't take him too seriously. After all, I had been here longer than he had, and I never felt anything out of the ordinary. At least not until that night. I shrugged it off, grabbed my flashlight, and started my usual rounds, checking the hallways, the elevators, and the back doors. The lights flickered as I walked through the long, narrow corridors, but that was nothing new. The hospital had electrical issues all the time. You'd get used to the flickering and buzzing, just another part of the job. But as I walked past the surgical wing, something caught my attention. It wasn't much, just a fleeting sensation, a chill in the air that hadn't been there before. The hairs on my neck stood up as I glanced around. It was that feeling you get when someone's watching you, even though you're alone. I brushed it off as nerves and continued walking. But as I turned the corner, the soft echo of footsteps followed mine. I stopped. They stopped. I glanced back, half expecting to see someone there. Nothing, just the empty hallway behind me. I couldn't help but shake it off. There was no reason to be paranoid, I told myself. This was just the quiet getting to me. This was my job. I'd done it 100 times before, and there was no reason this night should be any different. I continued my walk, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the thought that something was waiting in the darkness just out of sight. The clock ticked on as the night wore deeper into the hours. I finished my rounds and returned to the desk, my feet dragging. The silence was deafening, as always. The rest of the world was asleep, and the building felt empty, almost abandoned. But that night, it felt different, and I couldn't help but wonder if Greg was onto something. The night crept on, as it usually did in the hospital, where the time between hours felt like a haze, long, drawn out, and seemingly endless. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I sat back at the security desk, staring at the monitors. Greg had gone off to the far side of the building to check on something, leaving me alone in the lobby. There was a quiet hum that came from the monitors, a constant static noise that I had gotten used to, but tonight, something felt off. It was subtle at first, a soft scratching noise, almost like fingernails tapping against glass. I looked up from my screen, but there was no one in sight. I sat still for a moment, waiting for it to stop, thinking it was just another random sound. The old building had its quirks, and I had learned to live with them. But the scratching persisted, coming from somewhere down the hall. I decided to check it out. The silence felt thicker as I stood up, my boots scraping the tile floor. The night shift was often quiet, but this stillness was almost suffocating. The hallway was dark, save for a few flickering lights that cast long shadows on the walls. I made my way toward the source of the sound, the feeling of unease growing with each step. As I rounded the corner, the scratching stopped. Nothing. The hallway was empty, just like the rest of the building. But then I noticed something strange. A door at the end of the hall, the one leading to the old storage room, was slightly ajar. It wasn't supposed to be open. I knew that for sure because I had locked it myself earlier in the evening. I could have sworn it had been shut tight, but now it was standing wide open. I took a deep breath, my fingers curling around the flashlight I held in my hand. The sound had stopped, but I still felt the weight of it. Something was wrong. I stepped closer to the door, my heart thudding against my chest as I pushed it open slowly. Inside, the room was colder than it should have been. The temperature in the hospital was usually controlled, but this room always felt like it had a life of its own. It was mostly empty, except for old medical equipment, forgotten file cabinets, and stacks of paperwork that hadn't been touched in years. But tonight, something else caught my eye. In the far corner of the room, an old chair, one that I knew hadn't been used in ages, was rocking gently. There was no breeze. No windows were open. Yet the chair rocked back and forth, like someone had just gotten up and left. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I knew the chair had been stationary when I checked the room earlier. I was certain of it. It was the same kind of old wooden chair you'd expect in a place like this, rustic, worn down by years of use. And now it was moving, rocking slowly, almost rhythmically. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding, before I snapped myself out of it. I wasn't about to get spooked by a chair. The rational part of my mind tried to talk myself down. It had to be the wind, a draft from the hallway, or maybe just the building settling. But deep down, I knew it was something else. I took a cautious step forward, my flashlight beam catching the chair's movement in the dim light. It rocked gently, back and forth, as if waiting for someone to sit in it again. "Greg?" I called, trying to break the tension. No answer. The only sound that followed was the soft thump of the chair rocking back and forth. I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe it was just some weird coincidence. Maybe the wind had done it. But I had a feeling deep in my gut that this wasn't some simple explanation. I backed out of the room slowly, careful not to make too much noise. My pulse was racing now, my mind whirling with possibilities. As I stepped out into the hallway, I could feel my skin tingling, my senses on high alert. There was no rational explanation for what had just happened, but I had to keep moving. I had to finish my rounds. I closed the door to the storage room behind me and walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing louder than usual. The scratching sound had stopped, and the air had returned to its usual heavy silence. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I met up with Greg a few minutes later near the break room. He was leaning against the counter, scrolling through his phone. He looked up when I walked in, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You all right, man?" he asked, noticing the tense look on my face. "Yeah, just had to check something," I replied, my voice more clipped than usual. I didn't want to sound crazy, especially not to Greg, but deep down, I knew what I had just seen. It was real. "What happened?" he asked, sensing the unease in my tone. I hesitated, looking around the room, wondering if it was a good idea to tell him. But I had to. I was just walking by the storage room, and the door was open. I went in, and the old chair in there. It was rocking, like moving on its own. Greg's expression didn't change. He just looked at me for a moment, then snorted. "Yeah, all right. What's next? You gonna tell me the place is haunted?" I paused. I don't know, but it didn't feel normal. Greg let out a chuckle, shaking his head. "Dude, it's just the building settling. This place has been here forever. It's bound to do weird stuff." But the way he said it made me question myself. Was I overreacting? Could it have just been a draft or the old equipment? Maybe I had worked too many late shifts and was seeing things. Still, the unease lingered, like a shadow in the corner of my mind. A couple of hours passed without incident. Greg and I did our rounds together, checking the cameras, walking the halls. I tried to shake off the memory of the chair, but it kept coming back. As the clock in the lobby ticked past 3 a.m., I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. The silence that had always been a part of the night shift now felt oppressive, like it was suffocating me. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move out of the corner of my eye, just a flash, something quick. When I turned my head, there was nothing there. But then the lights in the hallway flickered again. The first sign was subtle, a faint scratching sound from somewhere down the hall. The door had been left ajar. The chair had moved. It didn't take long before I realized this wasn't just my imagination. Something was happening. Something I couldn't explain. And I had a feeling it wasn't going to stop. As the night dragged on, the eerie silence in the hospital seemed to tighten like a vice around me. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The longer I sat at the security desk, the more unsettled I became. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing small noises, footsteps, whispers, the faint sound of something scraping across the floor. But every time I looked around, there was nothing there. It had been 2 weeks since the incident in the storage room, and the oddities had only increased. At first, I tried to brush it off. Buildings settle. Fluorescent lights flicker. Old equipment makes strange noises. But these weren't just random occurrences. They were becoming too frequent to ignore. One night, I was patrolling the west wing of the hospital. It was one of the older sections, with long hallways and rooms that hadn't seen patients in years. The walls were stained with yellowing paint, the floors cracked and creaky underfoot. The smell of old, sterile air hung in the hallways, a mixture of dust and disinfectant that made my nose itch. But tonight, it was different. The air was thick, almost oppressive. I walked past room 204, and a sharp, sudden cold hit me like a gust of wind. It was coming from inside the room. I froze, my breath catching in my chest. The temperature had dropped several degrees, and my skin prickled with goosebumps. I knew this room hadn't been used in years, except for storage, and even then, it had always been locked. There was no reason for it to be cold, especially in the middle of summer. I slowly pushed the door open. The room was dark, save for the dim light from the hallway creeping through the cracks. The stale air hit me in waves, making my throat dry. But it wasn't just the cold. There was something else. The room felt wrong. There was a strange energy in the air, like static electricity clinging to my skin. The only thing in the room was an old metal gurney pushed against the far wall. But the moment my eyes landed on it, I felt a rush of dread. The sheets, pale and yellowed from years of disuse, had been moved. They were no longer neatly folded, they were tangled, as if someone had been lying there recently. The gurney itself was slightly shifted, its wheels turned in a different direction. I stepped forward, the sound of my boots echoing in the silence. Every inch of me screamed to turn around, to walk away, but something drew me closer to that gurney. I didn't know what I expected to find, but as I reached the bed, my flashlight flickered and went out. My heart skipped a beat. I cursed under my breath, fumbling with the flashlight, trying to get it working again. Just as the beam blinked back to life, I heard a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible rustle, like fabric brushing against fabric. I turned around, the beam of light sweeping across the room in frantic arcs. But there was no one there. The room was empty, silent once more. I backed away from the gurney, the feeling of being watched washing over me in waves. I didn't know how to explain it. There was no logical reason for the room to feel like this, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something or someone had been in there with me. I quickly left the room, closing the door behind me with a soft click. My hands were shaking, my pulse racing. The temperature in the hallway seemed to return to normal, but I couldn't calm the dread gnawing at the pit of my stomach. The next night, Greg and I were making our rounds when we reached the east wing. The section had been closed off for years, used only for storage. The walls here were even worse, peeling paint, exposed pipes, and the smell of mildew hanging in the air. But tonight, as we walked through the hall, something felt different. I glanced at Greg, trying to read his face. He seemed more on edge than usual, his eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. He didn't speak, but his tense posture said it all. I had been hearing strange things in the east wing, whispers in the dead of night, the sound of footsteps when no one was around, but I never told Greg. He would have brushed it off as nonsense, just the building making its usual noises. But tonight, he seemed to feel it too. We reached room 301, and the door was ajar. The same door that had been locked the night before. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Did you leave this open?" I asked Greg, my voice barely a whisper. He glanced at the door, then back at me. "No, I locked it last night. We both stood there for a moment, just staring at the door. The hallway felt quieter than usual, the silence almost suffocating. I took a deep breath and slowly pushed the door open. The room was empty, but there was something off about it. The air was thick, like it was holding its breath. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the flickering bulb in the hallway. The room was lined with old cabinets, piles of medical supplies, and sheets of paper scattered on the floor. But in the corner, something caught my eye. The old chair. The same one I had seen rocking that first night. It was in the corner again, but this time it was facing the wall. And on the floor beside it, there was something else, something that made my blood run cold. A dark stain, still fresh and wet, spread across the floor. It looked like blood. I stepped forward, my flashlight beam casting long shadows on the walls. My hands were trembling. Greg's voice broke the silence, low and hesitant. "What the hell is going on?" I didn't have an answer for him. I just stared at the stain, my mind racing. I'd seen bloodstains before, but this was different. This wasn't just an accident or a mess. This felt intentional. I turned to Greg, but when I looked back at the room, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. The chair, it had moved. It was no longer facing the wall. It was facing us. The temperature dropped. The hairs on my neck stood up. I wasn't alone. "Greg, we need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. He nodded, his face pale, but neither of us made a move to leave. Something was keeping us here, something we couldn't explain. Suddenly, the lights above us flickered, and I heard a low, guttural growl. It was coming from the back of the room, just behind the chair. I whipped around, my heart racing. The room was empty. We backed out slowly, never taking our eyes off the room. As soon as we stepped into the hallway, the door slammed shut behind us, echoing through the empty building. Neither of us spoke as we hurried to the security office. I don't know what Greg was thinking, but I was too scared to ask. All I knew was that the feeling of being watched had escalated. It was no longer just noises or strange events. It felt like something was actively watching, waiting for us to make a mistake. As the night stretched on, the occurrences became more frequent. I kept hearing faint whispers, feeling something brush against me when no one was there. The lights flickered more often, and the temperature dropped even further. But nothing was as terrifying as the feeling of being followed. I could hear footsteps behind me, always just out of reach. No matter how quickly I turned around, there was no one there. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was getting closer, closing in on me. The tension in the hospital was unbearable, suffocating. Every door I passed felt like it was hiding something. Every shadow seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. Something had changed in this place, something I didn't understand. The more I investigated, the more I realized that whatever was haunting these halls wasn't going to stop. The night had grown colder, if that was even possible. The silence was thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the irregular hum of the fluorescent lights above. I stood in the security office, my eyes fixed on the monitors. There was nothing unusual, nothing that could explain the chill creeping up my spine. But I knew something was wrong. Greg had left for his break a while ago, and I was alone again. For the first time, I was grateful for the solitude. The constant feeling of being watched, the whispering voices, and the shadows that seemed to move on their own had worn me down. The East Wing, especially, was starting to feel like a place I couldn't leave fast enough. I was trying to focus on the screen in front of me, but my mind kept drifting back to the room I had checked earlier, the one with the chair. The bloodstain. The chair had been facing the wall when I first saw it. Then it had moved. Now, the thought of it still facing us, still waiting, was enough to make my stomach churn. I rubbed my eyes and leaned back in the chair, taking a deep breath. I had been working too many hours, too many nights, but something told me that I couldn't leave. That feeling of dread, of anticipation, hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sharp crack of the intercom buzzing to life. It startled me, and I jumped, my hand instinctively reaching for the receiver. "Hello," I said, my voice wavering slightly. At first, there was only static on the other end. Then, a low, distorted voice came through, almost a growl. "Get out. Leave now." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't heard anyone approach the office, and the voice, it wasn't Greg's. It wasn't anyone I knew. I stood frozen, staring at the speaker, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. My heart was racing, and I felt the blood drain from my face. I wanted to pick up the phone, to call someone, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. "Who is this?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. There was a long pause. Then the voice came again, softer this time, almost sad. "You don't belong here. It's too late. You should have left when you had the chance." The intercom went dead, the static filling the room as the line cut off. I stood there for a moment, my hand still gripping the receiver. My mind raced. I knew I wasn't imagining things. That voice, it was real. I quickly slammed the receiver down and turned to the monitors. Everything seemed normal. The same empty hallways. The same flickering lights. But my eyes kept drifting back to the East Wing camera. There was something about it. Something that kept drawing me in. I had to know what was going on. I had to see it for myself. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand trembling as I made my way down the hallway toward the East Wing. The further I walked, the heavier the air became. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, and every step I took seemed to echo louder than the last. The sound of my boots on the linoleum floor was the only thing that kept me grounded, but even that felt wrong. The building had its own rhythm, its own pulse, and I was out of sync with it. When I reached the door to room 301, I hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, just like before. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the handle, my fingers slick with sweat. I opened the door slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. The room was dark, but the faint glow of the emergency exit sign outside cast a dim light into the space. I didn't see anything at first, but I felt it, the weight of the room pressing down on me, as if the very air itself was alive. Then, as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw it. The chair. It was facing the door, not the wall. But it wasn't just the chair that caught my attention. There was something else, something I hadn't noticed before. The dark stain on the floor, the one that had looked like blood, had spread. It had soaked into the floorboards, seeping into the cracks, and was now pulsing, slowly, like a heartbeat. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the corner of the room. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Then I saw it. A figure. A tall, thin silhouette stood in the corner, just beyond the chair. Its shape was distorted, like a shadow that was too dark to be real. I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel its presence. It was there, watching me. My breath hitched, my chest tight. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. Then the figure began to move. Slowly at first, then faster. The shadow stretched and shifted, its form becoming more defined. I could see the outline of a face, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. Its mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. Then, in a voice that was both in my head and in the room at once, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stumbled back, my mind racing for a way out, but my feet wouldn't obey. The figure advanced, its limbs unnaturally long, twisting at impossible angles. It was like watching a nightmare come to life. In that moment, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. My breath came out in visible puffs of steam. The walls seemed to close in, and the lights above flickered violently, casting the room into darkness. I heard a sound, a shuffle, then the unmistakable sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. I spun around, my flashlight flickering wildly, and saw a second figure, this one smaller, more hunched, but equally terrifying. It was dragging something behind it, a shape covered in what I could only describe as a tattered, blood-soaked sheet. The fear hit me all at once, a wave of panic that I couldn't control. I turned and bolted for the door, not daring to look back. My feet pounded against the floor. The sound of my breath ragged in my ears. But the door wouldn't open. I twisted the handle, yanked on it, but it was stuck. I could hear them behind me, the figures getting closer, their movements jerky and unnatural. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but the sound of my voice was drowned out by the growling, the scraping, the noise of something dragging itself toward me. Finally, with a violent tug, the door gave way, and I burst out into the hallway. The air felt warmer, but the terror didn't leave. I ran, not caring where I went, only that I had to get out. Every step I took felt like I was running through quicksand, the weight of the building pulling at me, holding me back. I don't remember how I made it back to the security office. All I know is that when I finally got there, I locked the door behind me, collapsed into the chair, and tried to catch my breath. My heart was still pounding in my chest, my body trembling uncontrollably. The monitors were all still on, showing the empty hallways. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the screens. Then the intercom crackled to life again. Leave. Now. The voice was clearer this time, but it was no longer distorted. It was calm, almost too calm, as if it was waiting for me to respond. I didn't. I couldn't. I just sat there, staring at the screen, the sweat dripping down my face, wondering how much longer I could hold on. How much longer until they came for me, too. The silence that followed felt deafening. And then I heard it. The faint sound of dragging footsteps, growing louder with each passing second. It was coming for me. And I didn't know if I could escape this time. The dragging sound was now unmistakable. It echoed down the hallway, reverberating through the walls like a distant reminder of something far worse lurking just beyond my reach. The weight of the silence before it had returned made everything feel impossibly slow, like time itself had begun to bend, stretching out the moments, making the fear last longer. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, threatening to tear free. Each breath I took was shaky, my fingers trembling violently against the desk. I couldn't stop thinking about the voices, the figures, and that horrific scene in room 301. I turned away from the security monitors, desperately trying to block out the images of the thing in the hallway, the shadow figures that had come after me. I knew I needed to do something. I couldn't just sit there and wait for whatever was out there to find me. It was clear to me now the hospital, this cursed place, wasn't just haunted by the past, it was alive. And it had been waiting for someone, waiting for me. I stood up and grabbed my jacket, the cold air of the office hitting my skin. The fluorescent lights flickered again, casting erratic shadows across the room, and I realized I wasn't alone anymore. No, I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't safe. Something was closing in on me. The intercom buzzed again. This time, the voice on the other end wasn't distorted. It wasn't a command either. It was almost sympathetic. You can't escape. It's already inside you. I could hear my breath quicken as the room seemed to shrink around me. I had to leave. I had to escape this nightmare. I grabbed my flashlight and stumbled out of the office. The hallway stretched out in front of me, darker than before, the air heavy with an unseen presence. The dragging sound had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was even worse. The building was holding its breath, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me to make a move, any move. I darted toward the exit, but halfway down the hall, I froze. The emergency lights flickered, and through the dim glow, I saw it. The same shadow I had seen in room 301, now standing in the middle of the hallway, blocking the only way out. Its form was distorted, but I could see the outline of a face, hollowed eyes, and a mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't a frown either. It was like something beyond human comprehension, a shape shifting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The fear was choking me, and all I could do was stare at it, paralyzed, as it slowly stepped forward. Then, out of nowhere, a loud crash echoed from behind me. I spun around, my body instinctively flinching. I didn't know what was making the noise, but I couldn't ignore it. The figure in front of me seemed to pause, its head tilting, as if listening to the same sound. For a brief moment, I saw an opening and opportunity. I darted to the side, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and bolted down the hallway in the opposite direction. The building seemed to stretch infinitely. Every hallway looked the same. Every turn led to more darkness. And yet, despite my frantic escape, I could still hear the dragging sound. It was growing closer again. I rounded the corner, desperate, nearly tripping on my own feet. In the distance, I saw the exit door just ahead. The feeling of hope surged within me, pushing me to run even faster. The sound behind me was relentless, as if something was chasing me, its footsteps dragging, scraping, moving in time with mine. I reached for the door, my fingers trembling as I pulled at the handle. It was locked. No, not now. I slammed my shoulder against the door, feeling the shock of the impact rattle through me, but the door wouldn't give. I turned around in a panic, my flashlight bouncing off the walls as I desperately scanned the hallway. The dragging sound had stopped, replaced by the steady pulse of my own heartbeat in my ears. I had to think. I had to find another way out, but it was impossible. The building felt like it was alive, shifting, closing in around me. It was as if the walls were closing, shrinking with each passing second. Then the air went completely still. A calm, oppressive silence settled over everything. And then something behind me moved. I didn't look. I couldn't. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. I felt the coldness of it on my back, the sensation of something too close, too real. I spun around, raising my flashlight to face whatever was behind me. It was the same thing, the same figure, but now it was closer than before. I screamed. The flashlight dropped from my hand, the beam cutting wildly through the air as I ran, blindly, desperately. The sound of my own feet pounding against the floor drowned out everything else. I ran through hallway after hallway, the figure always just behind me. But I couldn't outrun it. No matter how fast I moved, it was always there, the scraping, dragging noise getting louder, closer. I didn't stop until I reached the back stairwell, gasping for breath. The door was ajar. I had to take a chance. I shoved it open and stumbled down the stairs, not caring where I was going, just needing to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. When I finally reached the ground floor, I didn't wait. I ran straight for the exit. This time, the door was unlocked. My fingers barely made contact with the handle before I yanked it open, spilling out into the cool night air. I didn't look back. I didn't even care to breathe in the fresh air. I just ran, my legs aching, my heart racing, until I found myself at the end of the parking lot, away from the building, away from the nightmare that had been following me. But even as I stood there, panting, drenched in sweat, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that it was still out there, watching, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I never went back to that hospital again. I tried to put the whole experience out of my mind, but I couldn't forget it. No matter where I went, no matter how much time passed, that feeling of being watched never left. It lingered like a shadow that followed me everywhere. I never spoke to Greg again. He didn't come back after that night either. It was as if he had vanished, just like everything else in that cursed building. I tried asking around, but no one knew anything. It was as if everyone had forgotten about the hospital, as if it had never existed at all. But I knew the truth, and I would never forget the horrors I saw or the voice on the intercom telling me that I couldn't escape. The hospital was waiting for the next person to walk in, to hear its whispers, to witness its horrors. And I knew it would never stop. It was only a matter of time before it found its next victim. The years that passed since that night were filled with restless days and sleepless nights. No matter how far I tried to distance myself from the horrors of the hospital, they always seemed to find a way back into my thoughts. It wasn't just the haunting memories that plagued me. It was the nagging feeling that I had escaped only because something had allowed me to. That shadowy figure, those disembodied whispers, all seemed so deliberate, so calculated, as if something had wanted me to leave, to carry the fear, the curse, out into the world with me. At times, I tried to tell myself it was just a job, just an old hospital building, something forgotten and crumbling with time. I convinced myself that my mind had been overwhelmed, that it was the stress, the isolation, the long hours getting to me. I told myself that those shadows weren't real, and that the dragging sound wasn't anything more than the creaking of old pipes or the wind pushing through the broken windows. But I couldn't escape the truth that was buried deep inside me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The figure, the darkness that had moved in and out of rooms. I saw the blank eyes staring back at me, the twisted smile of something that wasn't human. I saw it in my dreams, in the reflection of windows, in the corners of rooms. The memories didn't fade. They lingered, each fragment more vivid than the last. It all started on a regular Thursday, the kind of day where everything feels like it's running on autopilot. I was just an average guy, doing what I did best, working a 9-to-5 job at a small marketing firm in the city. Life wasn't anything special. I wasn't a thrill seeker, and I didn't often find myself in situations that made my heart race. But something about that day felt different. I worked on the 5th floor of a building that had been standing there for decades. The building wasn't the tallest in the city, nor the newest, but it had this odd charm that drew me in. You know, that feeling you get when you walk into a place that has a history, something deeper than what the walls can tell you. But none of that mattered to me on most days. I just came in, did my work, and left. It was a routine. There was nothing out of the ordinary as I made my way into the office that morning. The usual elevator ride up was uneventful. I was alone, as usual. I was on the phone with my mom, checking in with her like I always did in the morning. That's one thing I'll never regret, keeping those little connections alive, even when the world around us feels busy and distant. But as I stood in the elevator, something felt off. The air was a little too still, the hum of the elevator a little too quiet. When I arrived on the 5th floor, I noticed that no one else was around. I walked into the office, greeted by the silence of an empty space. I had a few hours before the others came in, so I got comfortable at my desk. I remember the sound of the clock ticking louder than usual, as though the room was holding its breath. By 10 a.m., the office started to come alive. My colleagues trickled in, some with their coffees, others in deep conversation. But even then, something was off. The air felt different. It was thick with a strange tension. Everyone seemed a little on edge, though no one spoke about it directly. At first, I chalked it up to the typical work stress. After all, there was always some kind of deadline looming, some project to rush through. But the feeling didn't go away. It stuck with me like an uncomfortable weight on my chest. My office was on the far side of the building, which meant I had to pass through the central lobby every time I went to the restroom or took a break. The elevator was old, no longer the sleek machine it had been in its prime. The floor was scratched and worn, and the door groaned every time it opened and closed. It was a place I'd gotten used to over the years, but that day, it seemed to take longer to reach my floor. Each time I pressed the button, the elevator took longer to respond, and when the doors opened, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I dismissed it as a simple glitch, a malfunction of some sort. After all, the building was old, and old things break down. But that was before I got into the elevator that evening. I had stayed later than usual. It wasn't intentional. Sometimes you just get caught up in your work and lose track of time. It was nearly 9 p.m. when I decided to head home. The elevator was waiting when I stepped into the lobby. No one else was around. I pressed the button for the ground floor and waited for the familiar hum of the elevator to carry me down. But it didn't. The doors closed and the elevator jerked into motion. At first, it was like any other ride, smooth, quiet, uneventful. But then, halfway down, it stopped. Completely. The lights flickered once, then stayed dim. The usual background noise, the quiet whir of the motors, the subtle pinging of the floors passing by, stopped. I waited. Nothing happened. I pressed the button for the ground floor again, then the emergency button. No response. It was odd, but I wasn't panicking. It was just a malfunction, right? The elevator was old. It would fix itself. I wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but as the seconds ticked by, a cold knot of unease settled in my stomach. Minutes passed, and still nothing. I pressed every button, every option available, but nothing worked. I started to hear the faintest sound, a tapping, almost like someone was lightly knocking on the walls of the elevator. It was strange, almost rhythmic. I pressed my ear to the side, trying to figure out where it was coming from, but when I did, the tapping stopped. That's when the real unease set in. I had no idea what was going on, but I could feel it in my bones. Something was wrong. But I stayed calm. There was no reason to panic yet. I picked up my phone, but of course there was no signal. The building's walls were thick, designed to block out external noise, but now it felt like it was keeping me in. My phone felt useless in my hand, a lifeline that no longer worked. So I waited. I had no other choice. And as I stood there, the quiet began to stretch on, becoming more oppressive. The air in the elevator grew heavier, like I was sinking into it. Something was wrong, but I couldn't tell what it was. Then the lights flickered again. This time, they stayed out longer. I felt the temperature drop, a coldness settling in my skin, as though the walls were suddenly freezing. That's when I started to feel it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I wasn't alone in that elevator anymore. I don't know how to explain it, but the sensation was so strong that I could almost hear someone breathing in the corner. My heart started pounding in my chest. I took a step back, instinctively pressing myself against the back of the elevator, as if somehow that would protect me. Suddenly, the lights blinked on, and the elevator jolted forward again. I was thrown against the wall as it started moving rapidly, faster than usual. The floor numbers started blinking uncontrollably, spinning like a roulette wheel. My mind raced, and I couldn't make sense of anything. The elevator wasn't following its usual route anymore. It was going to places I didn't recognize. I remember the exact moment the first unsettling incident occurred. It happened so quietly that, at first, I wasn't sure I had experienced it at all. The elevator had stopped, sure, but I thought it was just another glitch and issue with the building's aging system, nothing more. I had been in this elevator countless times, and things always broke down from time to time. So I waited. The hum of the lights flickering was a constant in the back of my mind, but I did my best to push it out. However, the longer I stood there, the more the tension built. The elevator had stopped abruptly and the lights had flickered, and yet I hadn't heard a single sound from the building itself. Normally, I'd hear distant footsteps in the hallway or the faint sound of conversations from the floors above or below. But there was nothing now. The silence that stretched around me was almost oppressive. It felt as if the entire building had suddenly gone still, as though it had frozen in time. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Old buildings have quirks, after all. The elevator may have gotten stuck on a malfunctioning floor, or there could have been some sort of technical glitch. I tried to keep my cool. I pushed the emergency button again, just to get a response from the building service. Nothing. I pressed it once more, harder this time. Nothing. The button didn't even light up as it normally would. And that's when I felt it. A chill. It wasn't the sudden drop in temperature you'd expect from an air conditioner that kicked on, or the kind of chill you feel when a breeze sneaks through a crack. It was deeper, almost unnatural. It seemed to seep into my skin, creeping down my spine, sending an instinctual warning to my body that something was wrong. I looked around, scanning the small, confined space of the elevator. Nothing had changed. The walls were still the same faded blue, with the faintest hint of scuff marks and stains from years of use. The dim overhead light buzzed quietly, flickering for a brief moment before settling again. But it wasn't the elevator I was worried about. It was the feeling. That coldness that suddenly seemed to fill the room, the air itself thickening, making it harder to breathe. I began to notice the odd rhythm of the lights blinking faster, slower, in sync with the now slightly irregular hum of the elevator's mechanism. The whole thing was moving in waves now, like a machine struggling to keep its balance. My heart was pounding as I pressed myself against the back wall of the elevator. My mind raced through 100 explanations, none of them satisfying. It wasn't just the elevator glitching. It was something else. Something wrong. The tapping started. It was faint at first, like a distant knock, just on the edge of hearing. A tap, 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 slow, methodical. I held my breath, straining my ears to catch it. The taps didn't come from the outside, where I could see the faint shadow of light slipping in through the tiny gaps in the elevator doors. They were coming from within the elevator itself. I thought I was imagining it, but the sound was undeniable. The taps seemed to come from the wall to my left, the metal one that had a series of vents running along it. The rhythm was eerie, almost deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I shook my head, trying to shake off the paranoia that was creeping into my thoughts. It's just the building, I muttered under my breath, trying to convince myself. I wasn't alone. I wasn't losing my mind. This wasn't anything to worry about. But the tapping continued. My skin crawled with each tap, each second of sound that echoed through the small space. I was frozen, staring at the walls, waiting for some logical explanation, but none came. The air around me seemed to thicken even more, making it harder to breathe. My palms were sweaty, my heart racing. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. Just like that. Dead silence. And then, as if on cue, the elevator jolted, jerking me forward slightly. It didn't move, but the sudden shift in motion was enough to make me grab the handrail for support. My legs felt weak, and I nearly stumbled as the elevator lurched again, the lights flickering once more. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, not just with the elevator, but with the building, with the space around me. The sense of being watched grew stronger. I pressed the emergency button one more time, more out of desperation than hope. The buzzer sounded, but it was faint. The response was delayed, as if the system was struggling to hear me. Seconds turned into minutes. Every tick of the elevator's clock felt amplified, like it was counting down to something I couldn't yet see. It was just me, the cold, the silence, and the elevator that now felt more like a prison than a simple means of transportation. I glanced up at the ceiling, noticing for the first time that the small light overhead had stopped flickering and was now casting a steady, eerie glow. But what was worse, it didn't feel like it was coming from the light itself. It felt wrong, like it was coming from within the elevator. The temperature dropped further, and I shivered involuntarily. I glanced down at my feet, suddenly aware that the floor beneath me felt different, as if it had changed somehow. My mind raced again. Maybe it was a sign of some malfunction, something related to the wiring, or maybe the building's electrical system was shot. But as I bent down to check, the air seemed to grow even heavier. It was as though the elevator was closing in on me. The walls felt narrower, the space more confined. My breath caught in my throat as the strange tapping resumed, this time, louder, more insistent, and seemingly coming from all around me. I jumped back in panic, pressing myself into the corner of the elevator, my hands clammy against the cool metal. My eyes darted from corner to corner, trying to find some sort of explanation, but I couldn't. Then, without warning, the elevator lurched once more, this time, with much more force. The floor numbers above me began flashing rapidly, flickering erratically. It was as though the system was malfunctioning completely. The lights above me buzzed, flickered, and dimmed entirely. The elevator plunged into complete darkness. My breath came out in sharp, shallow gasps. The silence that followed was suffocating. It wasn't just a normal silence. It was a heavy, suffocating one. My mind raced with thoughts, with questions I couldn't answer. What was happening? Where was I? Why hadn't I been able to reach anyone? I slammed my hand against the emergency button again, but the elevator didn't respond. Suddenly, a sound echoed from the back of the elevator. A thud, then another. The panic surged, hot and overwhelming, flooding my system with fear. I didn't know what was making those sounds. I didn't know what was happening. But one thing was clear. I was no longer alone, and whatever was in that elevator with me had no intention of leaving. It felt like time had stopped when the elevator went completely dark. I tried to remain calm, to breathe deeply, but the sudden blackout amplified every sense of fear that I had been trying to suppress. The silence, thick and heavy, surrounded me. I couldn't even hear my own breath, as if the air had been stolen from the elevator itself. There was nothing, not even the faint hum of machinery or the buzz of lights overhead. I could feel my heartbeat in my chest, thudding louder than it ever had before. Each beat seemed to echo inside my head. The cold, unbearable cold wrapped around me like a second skin. It felt like it was inside me, in my bones. I could hear the rush of my blood, the whispers of my own thoughts, trying to make sense of the situation, but nothing made sense anymore. I fumbled for my phone, hoping for the brief comfort of a flashlight or a signal. I slid my fingers over the screen, but there was nothing. The screen was completely black. No bars, no service. I cursed under my breath. It had to be some sort of malfunction. This building was old, and the elevator system had been showing signs of wear for years. I wasn't the first to get stuck in one of these ancient lifts. I reached out, trying to locate the buttons on the panel. My fingers brushed across the cold, smooth metal, but there was nothing to indicate where the buttons were. I'd been in this elevator 100 times before, but now it felt unfamiliar, alien, as if the walls were closing in on me. Suddenly, the elevator jerked again, like a violent tremor, and then everything went still. My breath caught, and I held onto the side for balance. I could feel the slight vibration beneath my feet, a hum that seemed to come from deep within the floor, like the elevator was alive in some unnatural way. Then, the lights flickered on for a brief moment, illuminating the space just enough for me to see the panel before they flickered out again. That brief flash of light revealed something I had missed in my earlier panic, a dark stain on the floor. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. It was dark, smeared, and it looked almost wet. I stepped back, my stomach twisting. I couldn't focus on the stain. I had to focus on getting out. I reached for the emergency button again. The moment my fingers touched it, the elevator jolted once more, sending me tumbling back against the wall. The floor vibrated, and for a split second, I thought I could hear something faint, a murmur or a whisper, but it was impossible to tell. The sound was too distorted, too muffled by the walls, and the incessant ringing in my ears from the panic. I pushed myself upright, holding on to the handrail with a death grip. The floor beneath me seemed to be shifting, undulating almost like it was unstable. The air felt thick, oppressive. It was hard to breathe, like the elevator was sucking the oxygen out of the space. The fear I'd been feeling intensified with every second. My hands shook uncontrollably as I pressed the emergency button again, this time more urgently. There had to be someone on the other side, someone who could help. But again, no response. No buzzing sound, no confirmation that anyone had heard me. I looked at the panel again, hoping that maybe the light would flash back on, that I could see the numbers above. But nothing. Instead, I heard another sound, a scraping noise coming from the back of the elevator. It was slow, deliberate. My heart stopped in my chest. I froze, trying to listen closer. The scraping continued, a soft, grating sound that seemed to come from the elevator's walls, as if something or someone was moving just out of sight. I stepped back again, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My eyes darted around the small, enclosed space, looking for something, anything that might explain what was happening. There had to be a logical reason for this. Something, some malfunction or glitch. The idea that something unnatural might be happening was too much for my mind to handle. I could hear it more clearly now, the scratching sound. It was coming from the corner of the elevator, near the ceiling. My heart pounded in my chest as I instinctively looked up, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was causing the sound. And that's when I saw it. A crack. A small, thin crack had appeared in the ceiling. It wasn't there before. It was fresh, jagged, and dark. I couldn't tell if it was just a line of dirt or something more, but the crack seemed to widen, spreading slowly across the metal surface. My skin crawled. Then the lights flickered on again, briefly. In that split second, I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't the reflection of my own form in the dim light. No, this was something else. Something darker, more distorted. It moved across the elevator wall like a ripple in the air, disappearing the moment the lights flickered back off. I stumbled backward, my hand reaching for the panel, desperate to get out. I slammed my finger on the emergency button again, my mind racing, but nothing happened. The lights flickered again, this time staying on for a little longer. The shadow was gone, but the crack in the ceiling had grown larger. It now spread across the entire surface of the metal, and I could swear I could see something crawling behind it, moving in the shadows. I squeezed my eyes shut for a moment, trying to shake the thought. There was no way I could be seeing things. It was just the darkness, the fear, my mind playing tricks on me. I opened my eyes again, forcing myself to stay calm, to remain grounded in reality. The temperature in the elevator had dropped further, and I could see my breath now, a faint mist in the air in front of me. The lights flickered again, and I could feel the pressure in the air intensify, like something was pushing in from all sides. And then the elevator shook again, this time more violently, and the scraping sound returned louder, closer, more distinct. I pressed my hand against the wall, feeling the vibrations run through the metal. Something was behind the wall. Something was moving inside the elevator itself. It was almost as if the elevator had become alive, like it was no longer just a machine, but something else entirely. The scraping grew louder, now accompanied by a low, growling sound. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It felt like it was coming from everywhere, from within the walls themselves. I needed to get out. I needed to leave before whatever was happening inside this elevator consumed me too. I couldn't let it take me. I had to find a way out. The elevator trembled again, but this time it wasn't just a shake. It was a violent jolt that made the metal walls creak and groan in a way I'd never heard before. The scrape, the scratching, the growl, it was all getting louder, more frantic. The lights flickered out again, plunging me into pitch blackness, but that was when I felt it, something cold, something wet. It brushed against my cheek, like the fleeting touch of fingers. I jerked back in pure terror, my body slamming against the far wall of the elevator. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst through my chest. The air had grown heavy, suffocating, making it harder and harder to breathe. My panic was overwhelming, but something deep inside me told me I had to stay alert. I had to survive. Then, a low, guttural sound filled the space closer now, so much closer. It was a scraping, but it wasn't the elevator's walls that were making the noise. No, this was something. Something alive. Something was inside the elevator with me. I heard the shuffle of movement. It was slow at first, like the drag of something heavy against the floor. My skin prickled as I instinctively pressed myself further into the corner, every inch of me on high alert. I strained my ears, trying to catch every sound, every detail. The growling had stopped, but the shuffling remained, relentless. The elevator shifted again, and I almost screamed. My breath hitched as I pressed my hands to my face, trying to stave off the panic that threatened to drown me. I had to think. I had to stay calm. I fumbled for my phone once more, though I knew there was no service. But I needed something, anything, to break the tension, to stop my mind from spiraling. My fingers shook as I turned it on. The screen lit up, but there was no signal, no bars. It was just a blank screen staring back at me in the dark. But then, a new sound. A whisper, faint but unmistakable. It came from behind me, from the corner near the ceiling. It was a soft rustling, almost like the shuffle of cloth, followed by a wet sound. A slithering, dragging sound. I whipped my head around, hard in my throat, and then I saw it. A pair of eyes. Two dark, glistening orbs, staring directly at me from the top corner of the elevator. They were small, too small to belong to any human being, and they glinted in the darkness with an unnatural sheen. They didn't blink. They just watched me, unmoving, unblinking. Frozen in place, I couldn't tear my eyes away. The elevator was silent for a moment, as though it too was holding its breath. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing, but I couldn't. I couldn't find an explanation for those eyes. They were wrong, too wide, too dark, too alive. Suddenly, the elevator dropped again, and this time it wasn't a small jolt. It was like the whole building was collapsing in on itself. My stomach lurched as gravity seemed to stretch, pulling me toward the floor. My legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed to the ground, my hands scrabbling against the cold, slick surface of the floor. That's when the lights flickered back on, blinding me for a moment with their sudden brilliance. I squinted against the harsh light, my heart still pounding in my chest. And that's when I saw it, the thing that had been lurking in the shadows. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even close. A twisted, grotesque shape was crouched in the corner of the elevator, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale and mottled, like something that had been decaying for years, and it was covered in slick, blackened patches. But it wasn't the physical form that made my stomach churn. It was its face. It had no eyes, no nose. Its mouth was twisted into a permanent snarl, filled with sharp, jagged teeth that seemed far too large for its face. And then there was the smell, or rancid, overwhelming stench of rot that filled the air, burning my nostrils, making my throat tighten in disgust. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The thing, whatever it was, lifted its head slowly, its mouth opening wider, letting out a wet, choking sound. It was as if it was trying to speak, but the noise it made was incomprehensible, guttural, like something far beyond human language. The air around me thickened, and I could feel my own pulse in my throat. Every instinct in my body screamed for me to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in the elevator with this thing. The creature leaned forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. The floor beneath me seemed to tilt again, as if the elevator itself was being pulled by some invisible force. The thing reached out with one elongated, clawed hand, and I felt its cold, clammy fingers graze my arm. I recoiled violently, gasping for air, but I couldn't scream. My voice was gone. My throat was dry, constricted with fear. The thing let out a low growl, like a vibration deep within its chest, and I could feel the vibration in my bones. It didn't come closer, but it didn't pull away either. It just stayed there, staring at me, its mouth slowly opening wider. The smell was overwhelming now, choking me, suffocating me. I thought I was going to die in that elevator. The reality of it hit me all at once. This wasn't some malfunction. This wasn't some malfunctioning elevator. Something else was happening. Something unnatural. And just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, when the fear and the shock had reached their peak, the elevator dropped again. This time, it was faster, more violent. I was thrown to the floor, my body slamming against the cold metal with a force that left me breathless. But then, as quickly as it began, everything stopped. The elevator went silent. The lights flickered back to life, and for a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it had all been a hallucination, a nightmare playing out in the dark. But when I looked around, the thing was gone. The air was still thick, heavy with the stench of decay, but there was no sign of the creature. I was alone again. For a moment, I dared to hope that it was over, that the nightmare had ended. The silence was unbearable. It hung in the air like a thick fog, pressing down on me from every direction. I sat there, still on the cold floor of the elevator, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My hands shook uncontrollably as I pushed myself up, my legs weak from the fear and exhaustion. The stench of decay still clung to the air, but I didn't dare take a deep breath. Every instinct in my body screamed for me to escape, but I was frozen in place, too scared to move. I glanced at the control panel. The buttons were still lit, but there was no sign of life. The elevator hadn't moved in what felt like an eternity. I was alone, or so I thought. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Whatever had been in here with me, whatever had touched me, it hadn't left. It was still here, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I pressed my hand against the cold metal of the wall, trying to steady myself. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had just occurred. The thing with the eyes, no, the lack of eyes, the creature that had been crouched in the corner, watching me, moving closer with each passing second. My mind still couldn't comprehend it, couldn't wrap itself around the reality of what I had witnessed. I had to get out of here. But how? The elevator was stuck, and the doors were sealed shut. I could press the emergency button, but what good would that do? The creature had been inside with me, and there was no telling how far its influence stretched. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how trapped I was. The thought of calling for help crossed my mind, but my phone had no service. No one would hear me. No one could get to me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my back. I needed to think. I needed to act. Slowly, I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to try something, anything, to escape. I reached for the elevator buttons again, my fingers hovering over the panel. I was about to press the emergency call button when a voice echoed through the elevator, a low, gravelly voice, like the sound of someone dragging their nails across a chalkboard. The voice wasn't mine, and it wasn't human. Don't go. I froze. My heart stopped, and my blood turned to ice. The voice wasn't coming from the speakers, it was coming from within the elevator, from around me. I whipped my head around, but the creature wasn't there. It wasn't on the floor, in the corner, or at the ceiling. I was alone. Or at least, that's what I told myself. Please, I muttered under my breath, almost pleading with the empty space around me. I couldn't stay in this elevator any longer. I couldn't keep living in the nightmare. I had to leave. But how? How could I escape when the thing I had encountered was not something I could understand, let alone fight? I reached for the emergency call button once more, and this time I pressed it. The harsh sound of the button clicking echoed through the elevator, and then the silence returned. I waited, breath held, praying for a response, but nothing happened. No voice, no movement. The elevator didn't budge. I was on my own. You're not getting out. The voice came again, sharper this time, more insistent. It seemed to seep through the walls, curling around my mind like a heavy fog. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. The words, though clear, were nothing like the kind of voice a human being would make. It was too distorted, too other. I glanced at the elevator doors, as if willing them to open. Please, I thought. But the doors remained shut. The seconds dragged on, stretching into what felt like hours. Suddenly, the lights flickered again. But this time, it wasn't just the flickering of the lights. The entire elevator trembled, like something was trying to break free from the inside. The walls groaned, the floor rattled, and I felt my stomach drop as if the building itself was about to collapse. My body went rigid, and I gripped the control panel in a desperate attempt to keep my balance. There was no way out, no way to escape. But I couldn't give up. I wouldn't give up. I moved towards the elevator doors, pressing my palms against the cold metal. My mind was racing. My heart was thundering in my chest. I didn't care about the creature anymore. I didn't care about anything but getting out of that hellish elevator. I turned the emergency handle, hoping beyond hope that the doors would open. But the metal groaned in protest. I pulled harder, gritting my teeth, but the doors refused to give. I could feel it then, the thing, whatever it was, pushing against me. I could feel it pressing in on me, surrounding me, suffocating me. I took a deep breath, bracing myself. It wasn't just an elevator anymore. It was something much darker, much more sinister. This was no longer about finding an escape, it was about survival. The elevator lurched forward once more. A horrible grinding sound came from deep within the machine, and I heard the same guttural growl. The voice returned, mocking me. "You'll never leave." With every ounce of strength I had left, I shoved the emergency button again. This time, the doors didn't just open, they burst open, splintering as they peeled back. I didn't hesitate. Without thinking, I ran out of the elevator and into the hallway. My legs nearly gave out beneath me as I stumbled forward, my breath ragged, my pulse erratic. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I didn't want to know what was behind me. I reached the stairwell, bolted down the stairs, and didn't stop until I was outside, standing in the cool night air. The streets were empty, and everything felt too quiet, too still. The city hummed softly in the distance, but I felt an oppressive weight in the air, a weight that followed me even as I ran. It wasn't over. I knew that now. Whatever had been in that elevator, whatever had tormented me, it wasn't finished. The thing hadn't just vanished. It had followed me, waiting, lurking just out of sight. But at least I was free for now. I could feel it, though its presence lingering. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how many days passed, I knew I would never truly escape it. The question that haunted me now wasn't just what had happened in that elevator, or what that thing was. No, the real question was, why had it let me go? The days after the elevator incident felt like a blur. My mind, constantly preoccupied by the memories of that suffocating darkness, struggled to piece together the fragments of what had happened. At times, it felt as though I were living in a different reality, one where I had never really left the confines of that elevator. But deep down, I knew I had to move forward. I had to try to return to some semblance of normalcy, even though I knew that the things I had experienced weren't something I could simply forget. I didn't speak much to anyone about what had happened. Who could I tell? Who would believe me? The sensation of that thing, the weight of its presence, still pressed down on my chest. I couldn't escape the feeling that it was out there, waiting for me to slip up, to let my guard down. The thought of getting into another elevator made my skin crawl, and I took the stairs whenever possible. Even when I had to climb several flights, I chose to climb over the suffocating, stifling fear that gripped me every time I stepped into one. I knew something was following me. It wasn't just my paranoia. There were things I couldn't explain, things I couldn't deny. Every time I looked in a reflective surface, I saw something shift in the corner of my vision. It wasn't a person, but something other. A shadow, a movement that was out of place. I tried to dismiss it, but it became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just reflections. It was the sensation that I was never truly alone. The hairs on the back of my neck would rise for no reason. The sense of being watched, of something just behind me, always seemed to linger. The more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. The unease settled in deeper, and I could feel it gnawing at my mind, clawing at my thoughts. Then, one day, I received a message, a cryptic text, with no sender. It was short, but it froze me to the core. "You shouldn't have left." I stared at the message, my pulse quickening. The words burned into my mind. I didn't need to read it again to understand what it meant. The creature, or whatever it had been, was still watching me. It knew I had escaped. It knew I had defied it. I tried to move on, to continue my life, but there was no real escape. The world had become a twisted version of itself. Even in daylight, there was always a sense of something creeping just beneath the surface. It was like a shadow that followed me wherever I went, always present, never leaving. I would hear strange sounds in the middle of the night, the same scratching, the same scraping noises that had echoed through the elevator. I'd wake in the darkness, my heart pounding, knowing that it was still there, still reaching for me, waiting for the right moment. The truth was, I wasn't sure I had truly escaped. I wasn't sure that it had been the end. And now, Every time I passed an elevator, every time I was in a confined space, I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I wondered if it was really gone, or if it was just biding its time, waiting to claim me again. I did try to reach out to the building management to explain what had happened, but they had no answers. They told me there were no issues with the elevator. They assured me that everything was working perfectly fine. But I saw the way they looked at me, the way they hesitated before speaking. They knew something was off, even if they wouldn't say it. Was I losing my mind? Was this just trauma, twisting my perception of reality? I couldn't tell anymore. The message had been a wake-up call, and in many ways, it was the beginning of a new kind of fear. Not the terror of the elevator or the creature, but the fear of the unknown. The fear that I might never know what had really happened to me, what that thing had been, or why it had let me go. The fear that I had opened a door I couldn't close, and that door would always be there, just a step behind me. Every once in a while, I still hear the faint sound of a door opening in the dead of night, the same scraping sound. Sometimes I think I can feel the walls of the elevator closing in on me, even though I'm nowhere near one. The scent of decay, faint but unmistakable, lingers in the back of my mind, reminding me of the horror I lived through. There are nights when I lie in bed, eyes wide open, too afraid to sleep. I wonder if I'll ever feel safe again, if I'll ever truly escape. The world looks normal during the day, but I can't help but wonder if it's all just a mask, a thin veneer that hides the darker reality. Maybe we're all just one step away from something else. Something that waits for the right moment, the right slip-up, to reveal itself. It all started on a crisp autumn morning, just as the last remnants of summer faded into the background. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the small town I called home. The air was thick with the scent of decaying leaves, and the ground beneath my feet crunched with each step I took. Life was simple, mundane even, but I didn't mind. After all, there was something comforting in the normalcy of it all. My name is Mark, and I was just an ordinary guy, living an ordinary life in an ordinary town. Or so I thought. I had recently returned to my childhood home after years of being away. The bustling city life had worn me thin, and I longed for the peace and quiet of the countryside. The house was a modest, two-story structure nestled on the edge of a dense forest. It had been in my family for generations, passed down from my great-grandfather to my father, and now to me. The forest, too, had been a part of my life for as long as I could remember. It was always there, a dark silhouette on the horizon, looming just beyond the backyard. No one in town ever talked about it much. It was simply there. The house itself was not much to look at, a weathered exterior with faded paint peeling off in the corners. The windows were large, letting in plenty of light, but the wood was creaky and aged. The living room, where I spent most of my time, was filled with old furniture and photographs that had been left behind by my parents when they moved away. My life at that point consisted of getting settled back in, fixing up the house a little, and simply enjoying the quiet. I worked remotely, so I didn't have to deal with the stress of a 9-to-5 job, and my days were mostly spent walking around the property, tending to the garden, and reading. It was a simple life, but it suited me. My only companion during this time was my dog, Rusty. He was an old retriever, graying at the muzzle, but still full of energy. He had been with me since I was a child, and his presence brought me comfort. We would often walk together through the forest behind the house, sometimes for hours, with no particular destination in mind. It was during these walks that I first began to feel strange. There was something about the forest that unsettled me. It was quiet, too quiet. The birds didn't sing, and the wind never seemed to rustle the trees. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to the isolation I was experiencing after years of city living. I told myself it was just my imagination, a product of the boredom that settled in after too much time alone. But the more I explored, the more I felt as though something was watching me. I dismissed these thoughts as paranoia, chalking them up to the eerie silence of the forest. It was during one of these walks that I first saw it. The old stone well, half hidden by the overgrowth. I had passed it 100 times before, but for some reason, on that day, I couldn't look away. The well was ancient, the stones weathered and cracked. There was something unsettling about it, as if it had been forgotten by time itself. I made a mental note to investigate it later, but for now, I simply turned away, my heart beating a little faster than usual. Rusty, of course, didn't seem bothered by it. He was always happy to lead the way, tail wagging as he bounded through the trees. But for me, the atmosphere had changed. The forest no longer felt like the peaceful place it once was. It felt wrong. That night, as I sat in the living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. A sense of unease settled over me like a heavy blanket. I tried to ignore it, but it lingered in the back of my mind. The next few days passed uneventfully, with me trying to adjust to my new routine. I spent more time in the forest, hoping the strange feeling would pass. But with each visit, it only grew stronger. I found myself avoiding certain parts of the forest, drawn to the areas where I had never ventured before. The old well, for example, seemed to call to me, though I didn't know why. It was as if the forest was pulling me toward it, urging me to uncover its secrets. It was on a particularly foggy morning, when the mist hung thick in the air and the trees loomed like specters, that I decided to explore the well. There was something about the fog that made everything seem distant, as if I were walking in a dream. The further I walked, the more isolated I felt. The air was damp, and I could hear the faint rustling of leaves beneath my feet. But it wasn't just the sound that caught my attention. It was the absence of something that should have been there but wasn't. Rusty, usually so eager to explore, was unusually quiet that day. He trotted behind me, his usual enthusiasm replaced by an unsettling stillness. His ears were perked, and his eyes darted nervously around us. I couldn't blame him. I felt it too. The closer I got to the well, the heavier the air seemed to become. It was as though the very ground beneath me was shifting, and something ancient was awakening. As I reached the well, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I stood there for a moment, staring down into the darkness. The stone edges were slick with moss, and the scent of decay hung in the air. I couldn't explain why, but I felt drawn to it, as if it held the answers to questions I hadn't even thought to ask. My hand trembled as I reached out to touch the stone, and for a brief moment, I swore I could feel something watching me. Rusty growled low in his throat, his body tense beside me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Without thinking, I pulled away from the well and turned to leave. But as I did, I caught sight of something in the distance, something that made my blood run cold. Through the fog, I saw a figure tall, dark, and silent, standing among the trees. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew one thing for certain. It was watching me, and for the first time in my life, I felt as though I was no longer alone. But I wasn't sure if the figure was real, or if it was just the forest playing tricks on me. Either way, I knew something had changed. The forest was no longer just a part of my life. It was now a place I feared to enter, a place where dark things stirred just beneath the surface. I turned and walked back to the house, but the eerie feeling stayed with me. I didn't tell anyone about the figure. What could I say? Who would believe me? The town had always kept its distance from the forest. People whispered about it in hushed tones, but no one ever spoke of it directly. It was just there. As I sat alone that night, staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was calling me back. It wasn't a question of if I would return, it was a question of when. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before I would have to confront whatever lay hidden beneath the trees. The next morning was calm, but something was different. It wasn't the kind of difference you could explain easily. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of anticipation that seemed to hang over the house. The fog was thicker than usual, swirling in the trees and creeping along the ground like some kind of living thing. I had gotten used to the fog around here, but today it seemed more oppressive, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Rusty, as always, was my constant companion, though his usual cheer was absent. He trotted beside me, his tail hanging low, ears flattened against his head. He wasn't barking or sniffing the ground like he usually did during our morning walks. Instead, he seemed distracted, nervous, even. I could tell something was off, though I didn't want to admit it to myself. I shook off the feeling, telling myself that it was just my imagination. Maybe I was still adjusting to being back in this quiet town, and the forest was simply getting to me. We reached the well again, the stone structure barely visible through the thick fog. I had decided the day before that I would stay away from it for a while. There was something about it that unnerved me, something I couldn't put my finger on. But today, as we walked past it, I noticed something strange. The well, which had been completely still the day before, now seemed different. The surface of the stone was wet, almost as if it had just rained. But there hadn't been any rain. The air was dry, and the ground beneath my boots was dusted with fallen leaves, not damp at all. My breath caught in my throat as I crouched down beside the well, running my fingers along the edge. There was a faint residue on the stone, slick and cold to the touch. My stomach twisted, but I couldn't look away. It was as if something or someone had been there. I glanced down into the well, trying to make out the shadows beneath the surface, but the mist was too thick. The darkness was consuming. I quickly stood up, brushing my hands off and shaking my head. It didn't make sense. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the forest was responding to me. Rusty whined, tugging at his leash, eager to move on. I gave him a reassuring pat on the head and started walking again, but the unease gnawed at me. The air felt colder, the fog thicker, and the path ahead seemed to twist unnaturally. It wasn't long before I began hearing noises. At first, I thought it was just the wind. A rustling of leaves, a snap of a twig. But as I continued along the path, the sounds became more distinct, more deliberate. A footstep, a crunch of gravel, and then a breath. It was so soft that I almost missed it, but it was there. A shallow intake of air, as if something was close behind me. I turned around, expecting to see Rusty, but he was nowhere near me. He had stopped several feet back, staring at something in the trees. His body was rigid, his nose twitching in the air, as if he were sniffing something familiar. But he didn't move. I called out to him softly, trying to get his attention. His eyes met mine, but there was no warmth there, only a deep, unsettling look of caution, like he was trying to tell me something I didn't understand. "Rusty, come on," I said, my voice tight. But he didn't move. I walked back toward him, my footsteps heavy in the silence. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I approached. Rusty didn't budge from his spot, his eyes locked on a particular spot in the trees, something just beyond my sight. I glanced over my shoulder, but all I could see were the trees shrouded in mist. They loomed over us like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches twisted into strange shapes. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something wasn't right. The silence was broken by a soft, distant sound. It was like the sound of rustling leaves, but it wasn't the wind. It was something heavier, more deliberate. I froze, my eyes scanning the foggy woods, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. The trees stood still, the forest silent once again. Rusty's low growl broke the stillness, and I knelt beside him, feeling his tension in the air. His body was rigid, his fur bristling along his back. I reached out and placed a hand on his head, trying to calm him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I scanned the area again, my eyes narrowing as I looked for anything out of place. That's when I saw it. A figure, barely visible through the trees, standing just beyond the mist. It was tall, too tall for any ordinary person. Its outline was shrouded in shadows, and it didn't seem to move, just stood there, watching. My heart pounded in my chest. I stood up straight, but my legs felt weak beneath me. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, telling myself it was just a trick of the fog. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Something was there. Something that didn't belong. "Rusty," I whispered, my voice shaking. The dog growled again, louder this time, but still refused to move. He was as terrified as I was. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the figure. It didn't follow me, didn't move at all, but the air around me felt thick with tension. I felt like I was being watched, scrutinized by something that wasn't quite human. As I stepped backward, my foot caught on a root and I stumbled. Rusty's bark broke the silence as he finally bolted, running back the way we came. I quickly regained my balance, my pulse racing, and without hesitation, I turned and ran after him, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back again. I didn't dare. I reached the house in a matter of minutes, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and I leaned against the door, trying to steady my breathing. Rusty was at my side, panting heavily, his body still tense, eyes darting around the room. We were safe at least for now, but I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing in the mist, watching me. I didn't know what it was or why it was there. All I knew was that something was wrong, and I had barely begun to scratch the surface. The unease I had been feeling since I arrived in this town had just shifted into something far darker, far more real. The forest wasn't just a place of quiet solitude, it was something else, something ancient. And I was only beginning to understand the consequences of stepping into its depths. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside made my heart race. I kept thinking about the figure, wondering if it was still out there, waiting. Rusty stayed close, his presence offering little comfort, as if he too understood the gravity of what we had encountered. I thought about going to the authorities, telling them what I had seen. But what would I say? There was no proof, no way to explain it without sounding insane. So I kept it to myself. I tried to convince myself it was just a bad dream, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. The forest was calling, and it had already marked me. The days that followed the strange encounter in the forest blurred together. The fog never seemed to fully lift, and I found myself constantly on edge, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me. I tried to continue with my routine, walking Rusty, checking the house, attempting to do some work, but nothing felt normal anymore. The air itself felt thick, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. At first, the strange occurrences were small, easily brushed aside. Objects would be out of place when I knew I had left them in a certain spot. A spoon on the counter would shift to the side. An empty chair would be facing a different direction. Rusty would bark at nothing, his gaze fixed on some corner of the room or the woods beyond the house, but there was nothing there. The house felt colder, too. No matter how high I turned the heat, there was a chill in the air that made my breath visible in the mornings. One evening, as I sat by the fireplace, I noticed the sound of scratching soft at first, like a twig being dragged across the wood. It came from outside, from the direction of the forest. My eyes darted to the window, but I saw nothing in the dim light. I stood up slowly, my pulse quickening, and crossed to the door. Rusty was sitting by my feet, his ears flat against his skull, staring at the door with an intensity I had never seen before. His growl was low, almost inaudible, but I could feel the tension in his body. I opened the door, my heart pounding in my chest, and stepped out onto the porch. The night air hit me with a rush of cold, and I drew in a sharp breath, trying to steady myself. The fog hung thick in the trees, the forest eerily still. The scratching noise continued, louder now, as if something or someone was dragging its nails against the bark of a tree. I stepped off the porch, my boots crunching on the gravel path. Rusty stayed close, his hackles raised, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. The trees around us were silhouettes in the thick mist, their branches stretching out like skeletal arms. My eyes scanned the shadows, but I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything except for the eerie scraping sound that seemed to be coming from deeper within the woods. I walked cautiously toward the source of the noise, my breath fogging in front of me. Rusty was silent now, but his body was rigid, his eyes darting around. The further I went, the more oppressive the air became. The temperature seemed to drop with each step, the chill creeping down to my bones. I reached a clearing, and there it was, an old tree, its bark worn and scratched as if something had been clawing at it for years. The sound was louder now, almost deafening, coming from the very heart of the tree itself. I could feel my pulse racing, my mind screaming at me to turn back, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the scratching stopped. Silence descended on the forest like a heavy curtain. I stood there for a moment, frozen, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. I turned back toward the house, my legs feeling weak, my mind racing. The fog had thickened, making it almost impossible to see more than a few feet in front of me. I hurried back to the house, Rusty at my side, and slammed the door shut behind me. That night, sleep came reluctantly. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside made my heart race. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, never left me. I lay awake, my mind replaying the events of the evening over and over. What had caused that sound? What had I seen? And why hadn't I been able to look away? The next day, things escalated further. I decided to investigate the well. The sense of unease I had been feeling since my first encounter with it had only grown, and I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I needed answers. I walked back into the woods, Rusty trailing behind me, his unease palpable. The fog was thicker than ever, and I found myself stumbling over roots and branches that seemed to reach out from the darkness. The familiar trail seemed different now, as if the forest was closing in around me. I felt it in my chest, a heavy weight that pressed down on me, making it harder to breathe. The trees seemed to whisper, though there was no wind to carry the sound. When I reached the well, I noticed that the strange residue I had touched the day before was gone, but something else was there. A faint trail of something, mud, blood, led from the edge of the well, snaking through the underbrush and disappearing into the trees. My heart skipped a beat as I followed the trail with my eyes, but I couldn't bring myself to go any further. Something about the well, about the forest, felt like it was warning me, like it was daring me to look closer. I took a step back, but just as I turned to leave, I heard it. A faint sound, almost like a sigh, drifting through the trees. I froze. I knew it wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. I turned around, my body tense, and scanned the woods. The fog had thickened even more, and I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. But I felt it. There was something there, something moving just out of my sight. Suddenly, Rusty barked, and I whipped around, my heart leaping into my throat. The dog was standing on alert, his body stiff and his gaze fixed on the trees. I looked in the direction he was staring, but saw nothing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched again. I wanted to run, to get back to the safety of the house, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. Then the air shifted. It felt charged, as if a storm was on the verge of breaking. The fog swirled around me, and I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. I didn't turn to look. I couldn't. I simply turned and ran, Rusty at my heels, desperate to escape whatever was closing in on me. Back at the house, I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, gasping for air. Rusty was pacing by my side, his eyes darting to the windows, his low growl the only sound in the room. I sank to the floor, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. The forest was no longer just a place. It was a presence, something that was growing more and more hostile with each passing moment. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't keep running, but I didn't know how to stop what was happening. Something in the forest was changing. Something ancient, something malevolent, was waking up, and it wasn't going to stop until it had me. I could feel it in my bones. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought I heard a voice, a low, guttural sound coming from the woods. It was too faint to be clear, but it was there, and it was calling my name. The night had become suffocating. The sound of my pulse thundering in my ears drowned out everything else. It was as if my body had gone into autopilot, moving on instinct alone. I had become a stranger in my own skin, caught between the horrors I had witnessed and the terror that gripped me now. The house, once a refuge, now felt like a prison, a place where the shadows pressed closer, the walls seemed to close in, and the ever-present, unbearable weight of something dark and insidious crept deeper into my bones. Rusty's growls were constant now, a low rumble that vibrated through the air. He would dart from one window to another, always looking outward, always on edge. I had tried to reassure myself that I was just letting my imagination get the best of me, but deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. There was something out there in the forest, something far worse than I could have ever prepared for, something that wasn't going to stop until it had me. The wind had picked up again, its howls echoing in the night, as if the world itself was in turmoil. I could hear branches snapping, leaves skittering across the porch. But it wasn't the storm that unsettled me, it was the sound that followed. The faint whisper of footsteps, slowly and deliberately, shuffling around the house. It was the same slow, almost methodical pace that had followed me through the forest. I wasn't alone. I stood frozen, my back pressed against the door. The room seemed too small, too suffocating. Every window, every corner, felt like it was hiding something. I tried to breathe, but my chest felt tight, the air too thick to inhale properly. I could feel the weight of something intangible in the space with me. A presence that wasn't just outside the door, but within the walls themselves. Rusty's growls had escalated into frantic barking now, sharp and urgent. He clawed at the door, his paws slipping on the wooden floor, as if he was trying to escape, trying to warn me of something. And then I heard the sound of scraping against the door, slow and deliberate, as if something was trying to tear its way inside. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering in my chest. I was trapped. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the house creaked in protest, as if it too was struggling against something far darker. The door began to shudder under the force of whatever was on the other side. I didn't know whether I was imagining it, but it sounded like a voice, a low, guttural murmur just beneath the howling wind. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was calling me. Before I could process the thought, the door suddenly flew open with a force that knocked me back. The room was filled with a cold, suffocating presence, the temperature dropping so quickly I could see my breath form in the air. I scrambled to my feet, but before I could react, I felt something grip my leg. I looked down, panic rising in my chest as I saw nothing but darkness. The air itself seemed to have reached out and bound me. Then, the light from the hallway flickered, casting an eerie glow on the figure standing in the doorway. A shadow, tall and twisted, its features barely visible, but unmistakable in the dimness. It was an outline, jagged and unnatural, its form constantly shifting like a mirage. The dark figure stood motionless, its cold eyes piercing through me, locking onto mine. I could feel the weight of its gaze as it assessed me, as if it were trying to decide whether I was worthy of its attention or whether I was just another victim. I tried to speak, to ask it what it wanted, but my throat was dry, my words stuck in my mouth. I tried to move, to run, but my body refused to obey. The thing in the doorway tilted its head slightly, a sound like an almost imperceptible growl escaping from it. I could feel its malevolence pressing down on me, suffocating me in its presence. And then it began to step forward. The first step was slow, calculated, and as it did, the air seemed to grow even colder, as though the warmth of the world was being sucked into it, swallowed whole. The second step was closer, and I could see the details now, the elongated arms, the fingers twisted and clawed, the unnatural angles of its body. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. And then the smell hit me. It wasn't just the damp, earthy smell of the forest that had begun to invade the house. It was something foul, something rotten. The stench of decay, of something long dead and left to rot in the dark, filled my nostrils. It made me gag, my stomach turning in disgust, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. I couldn't look away. "Get out," it whispered, its voice low, like the rustling of leaves in a long-forgotten graveyard. The words were so cold, so chilling, that they felt like ice entering my veins. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs were frozen to the floor. The terror that gripped me now was unlike anything I had ever felt. It wasn't just fear. It was something worse, a deep, primal dread that clawed at my insides, making every fiber of my being scream in terror. I felt my breath catch in my throat as the figure moved closer, each step bringing it nearer, and I finally managed to stumble backward, gasping for air. Rusty was at my feet, his growls now feral, but even he seemed paralyzed, unable to do anything but watch. The thing's cold gaze never left me, its form inching toward me with relentless purpose. And then, in a blur of motion, I saw it. The figure's hand shot out, faster than I could react, and I felt its fingers brush against my arm. The contact was freezing, as if ice had spread through my very blood, and a flash of images flooded my mind, images of the forest, of the well, of things that I couldn't even understand, memories that weren't mine, but felt like they were. I saw faces twisted in agony, bodies contorted in unnatural ways, and the sense of suffering so deep it made my stomach churn. The grip tightened. In that moment, I understood. This wasn't just a spirit, or a ghost, or some fleeting nightmare. It was something older, something far worse, an entity bound to the forest, to the land itself. It had been waiting, watching, hungry for the right moment to strike. And now, it had me. The pressure on my arm intensified, and I could feel my body growing weaker, as if my very life force was being drained away, swallowed by this entity. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The room spun around me, the walls bending in on themselves as the thing's presence overwhelmed every sense I had. I could see the trees, the fog, the darkness of the forest in my mind's eye, all of it closing in, wrapping around me like a suffocating cocoon. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, when I thought I was about to succumb to whatever it was that stood before me, something snapped inside me. A surge of adrenaline, a moment of clarity. I lunged forward, breaking free from its grip and stumbling toward the door. The house, the forest, the thing, it didn't matter. I had to get out. I didn't care where I was going, as long as I was away from that thing. But as I burst through the door and into the night, the cold, suffocating air of the forest wrapped around me again, and I knew I had only just begun to unravel the horrors that awaited me. I ran. The cold wind cut through my clothes, freezing my skin, but I didn't care. I couldn't care. The only thing that mattered was escaping the house, the forest, the thing that had nearly consumed me. I stumbled through the brush, branches slashing at my face, the ground beneath my feet slick and uneven. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart thudding in my chest, but I didn't dare look back. Every step forward felt like survival. Behind me, the house loomed like a shadow in the distance. The lights inside flickered and died, and I knew without looking that the thing was still there, waiting. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't go back. Not even for Rusty, whose frantic barks echoed from the house, growing fainter as I put more distance between us. The dog's barking seemed distant now, and in some way, it was a relief. Maybe he had found a way out too. Or maybe, just maybe, he was better off staying behind. I didn't know. I couldn't think. I just had to move. I hadn't planned to be out here this long. The forest seemed endless, its trees like towering sentinels watching my every move. I kept going, the sharp scent of pine and earth clinging to the air, but there was something off about it. The night had become unnaturally still, and the darkness felt deeper, more oppressive. It wasn't the usual stillness of the forest at night. This felt like something watching, something just beyond the veil of the trees, always just out of reach, waiting for the right moment. I could feel the pull, an invisible force drawing me back, but I ignored it. I had to. If I didn't, I knew I would never leave. Time seemed to lose its meaning as I trudged deeper into the forest. The moon, obscured by thick clouds, offered no light to guide me, leaving me to navigate by the dim light of my phone. Each step I took felt more desperate, as if I was racing against an unseen clock that was ticking down to something inevitable. I tried to make sense of everything that had happened, the figure in the doorway, the whispers, the strange coldness that had settled over the houses. I had seen the horror in its eyes, the twisted form of the thing that had stalked me for days. But why? Why had it chosen me? Why had it followed me into that house? The air felt wrong, suffocating. I needed to get out of the forest, but the path I had chosen seemed endless, like it kept looping back on itself. No matter which direction I turned, the trees looked the same dark and unwelcoming. The ground was soft beneath my feet, wet and slippery from the rain that had started to fall, but I was too disoriented to even think about finding shelter. Every time I tried to focus on anything, my thoughts scattered. All I could hear was the rush of blood in my ears and the echo of footsteps that weren't mine. The night pressed closer. I was running on instinct now, barely aware of where I was or what I was doing. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fog rolled in. Thick, dense, and suffocating. It blanketed the forest like a shroud, swallowing the trees and turning everything into a blurry, indistinct haze. The temperature dropped again, even colder than before. I could feel the moisture in the air, my clothes growing damp, my breath shallow and labored. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a shadow through the fog. But as I moved closer, the outline of a figure emerged, tall and dark, its edges blurring in the mist. It was standing in the middle of the path, blocking my way. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, my entire body going cold, every muscle locked in place. I knew that shape. I recognized it, the same twisted figure that had haunted me in the house. It was back. The fog pressed in around me, the air growing so thick I could hardly breathe. The figure didn't move, but its presence felt suffocating, as if it was drawing the life from the very air around me. The cold seemed to wrap around me, gnawing at my bones, and the stench of decay flooded my senses again. I tried to scream, to run, but my legs felt heavy, as if they had turned to stone. "You didn't listen," the voice rasped, low and guttural, like dry leaves scraping across the ground. I could feel it inside me, a cold, vile presence that slid under my skin, wriggling into my thoughts, twisting them until they didn't make sense anymore. The figure moved in, slow and deliberate, and I felt a wave of pure terror flood my chest. It took one step forward, then another, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I wanted to run. I needed to run, but my body refused to move. "You are mine now," the voice whispered, though it wasn't coming from its mouth. It was everywhere, in the air, in my mind. It was inside me, suffocating me. I felt the grip of despair tighten around my chest. There was nowhere to go. No escape. This was it. This was the end. But just as the figure reached for me, a burst of light illuminated the fog, breaking through the darkness like a beacon. I didn't know where it came from, but in that moment, it didn't matter. It was like the light had sliced through the night, banishing the shadows, breaking the hold of the thing that had been tormenting me. I fell to the ground, gasping for air, my body shaking uncontrollably. The fog seemed to retreat, the figure vanishing into the mist as if it had never been there at all. I could barely comprehend what had just happened, what I had just witnessed. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of it. But all I could do was crawl toward the light, toward whatever safety it promised. I didn't care if I was hallucinating or if I was truly awake anymore. I just needed to be away from that thing. The light grew brighter, and I saw a figure approaching through the fog, a human silhouette. I tried to speak, but my voice was barely a whisper. I couldn't form the words. The figure knelt beside me, and I felt a hand on my shoulder. I didn't know who it was, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I let out a shaky breath, the terror that had clung to me now dissipating into nothingness. The figure spoke softly, words that I couldn't quite understand at first. "You're safe now. It's over." But I wasn't so sure. The figure's presence felt different, comforting, but I knew that the thing in the forest, the thing that had followed me, was still out there. It had to be. It wasn't over. Not yet. But I was alive. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I was led out of the forest, away from the terror that had gripped me for so long. And though I knew I had escaped it, I knew I would never be free of it. The haunting feeling of its presence lingered, seeping into my thoughts, into my dreams. I couldn't shake the image of its eyes, those cold, empty eyes. And in the quiet of the morning, when the fog had finally lifted, I understood the truth. Some things never let go. They follow you, like shadows, no matter how far you run. The days that followed felt like I was in a dream, a world where the sun never truly shone, and the air always carried the weight of the unknown. I went through the motions of life, pretending everything was normal, trying to convince myself that the forest, the house, and that thing, whatever it was, were behind me. But there was no escaping the truth. It lingered, always. In the back of my mind, in the corners of my thoughts, there was no erasing the memory. It was as if the forest had left its mark on me, like a scar that wouldn't fade, no matter how hard I tried to cover it up. Every shadow, every creak of the floorboards at night, every gust of wind that rattled the windows brought me back to that moment in the fog. That thing was still out there. I knew it. I couldn't explain it to anyone. They wouldn't understand. How could they? How could I possibly make them believe what I had seen, what I had felt? The truth was, I couldn't even believe it myself. It didn't make sense. The figure in the house had been real, and yet it was unreal. A distortion of something human, something that shouldn't have been. And the whispers, the way it had spoken to me, the voice curling into my thoughts like it was trying to pull me in, to make me part of it, was something beyond comprehension. I started avoiding the forest, and even that house. I didn't want to risk running into whatever it was again, nor did I want to revisit the nightmare that had nearly consumed me. I moved to a new place, somewhere far away from the forest, hoping that distance would somehow help me leave it all behind. But it never really did. The feeling of being watched, the cold chill that would sometimes creep up my spine when I walked alone at night, stayed with me. It wasn't something that could be outrun. There were nights when I would lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the room dark and quiet, my heart racing. I could hear the wind, the rustling of leaves outside my window, and for a split second, I would think I was back there, in the forest. It would be the smallest thing, a creak in the floor, a shadow in the corner that would make me freeze, my mind racing with the fear that it was coming back. The thing, the house, the woods, it all blurred together in my mind. The line between what was real and what was imagined was thinner than I wanted to admit. In those moments, I'd close my eyes and try to tell myself it was over, that it had ended with the figure disappearing into the fog, with the light that had come and pulled me out of that nightmare. But I knew better now. I knew that some things don't just disappear. They follow you. They latch onto you like a curse until you no longer know where you end and they begin. I had been touched by it, marked by it, and now there was no going back. I didn't speak of it again. The experience had shattered something inside me, and I couldn't bring myself to talk about it. I couldn't even begin to explain what had happened in the forest that night. I had survived, yes, but at what cost? What was left of me after that? I became more withdrawn, not wanting to deal with anyone, not even with myself. I tried to bury the memories, to forget the feel of the cold, the whispers, the eyes that never stopped watching. But the truth is, you can never truly forget. Every time I found myself near a forest, near a house too quiet or too empty, I couldn't help but feel that pull. The urge to look over my shoulder, to listen for footsteps behind me, to hear the echoes of that thing in the darkness. I couldn't outrun it. It was like a shadow, a piece of me that I couldn't escape. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring at the night sky, at the stars that twinkled so far away, and I would wonder if I was the only one who had ever experienced something like this. If anyone else out there had seen what I had seen, or if I was just a victim of my own mind. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it didn't matter. The house, the forest, the thing in the fog, it was all part of something bigger. Something ancient, something that had existed long before I ever set foot in that place. It had been waiting for someone like me, someone who was foolish enough to ignore the warning signs, to walk too close to the darkness. There were moments, though, when I thought I had moved past it. When I'd go about my day, laughing with friends, working, doing everything I could to feel normal again. But in those rare moments of silence, when I was alone with my thoughts, it would return. The memories would flood back like a tidal wave, dragging me under again, drowning me in that cold, suffocating fear. I've come to accept it, in a way, that there is no escape from what I saw. That the house in the forest was a door, one that I opened, and one that I could never close. The thing that followed me, that haunted me, was a reminder that some things are beyond our understanding, beyond our control. And no matter how far we run, no matter how fast we flee, we can never truly leave them behind. It was just another move for me, another change in a long line of them. After years of bouncing from one city to another, I found myself in a small town in the middle of nowhere. A place that felt like it had been forgotten by time, nestled in the shadow of an aging mountain range. You know, the kind of town, the sort that's quiet, almost to the point of eerie, where the only sound you hear is the wind blowing through the trees, the occasional bark of a dog, or the creak of an old porch swing. There's something about a town like this that makes you feel as though you're living in a different era, disconnected from the chaos of the modern world. The house I moved into wasn't new, not by any means. It had stood for generations, passed down through families like a heavy burden. But to me, it was perfect. It had that old charm, the kind of home that was built to last, with dark wood floors that creaked underfoot, and a staircase that seemed to whisper when you climbed it. It had character, something most modern homes were missing. It wasn't large, just a small 3-bedroom with a basement that had been mostly unused for years. I had no plans to do anything with the basement, not at first. I just wanted a peaceful place to settle, to write, to escape. The first few days were normal. I spent my time unpacking boxes, rearranging furniture, and getting to know the house. The walls were lined with old wallpaper that had yellowed with age, and the windows creaked open with a bit of force, but nothing unusual stood out. It was the kind of place where you could imagine long-forgotten conversations floating through the walls, where you could almost feel the presence of past lives that had come before you. I didn't have many neighbors, and the ones who were there kept to themselves. The local grocery store was a few blocks away, and the small cafe on the corner had a quiet charm about it, the kind of place where you could sit for hours with a cup of coffee and watch the world pass by. I didn't have a particular routine yet, but each day felt comfortable, familiar even, despite the fact that I was in a new place. The only oddity in the house, something that seemed out of place from the very beginning, was a locked door in the basement. It was an old wooden door, not particularly sturdy, but the lock on it seemed to hold something inside that I couldn't see. It was strange because when I moved in, the real estate agent had mentioned nothing about it. The house had been on the market for a while, but no one had seemed to bother with the basement either. There was no mention of what could be behind that door, nothing that could explain why it had been locked for so long. It wasn't like I was particularly interested in what might be behind that door. It wasn't like I had some burning curiosity to pry into the past of the house. But there was something about it that felt off. Not in a way that made me panic or feel like I should leave, but just enough to catch my attention. I told myself it was nothing, a forgotten closet or some old storage room that had been left behind. After all, I wasn't the first person to live here, so whatever was behind that door was probably something trivial, something left behind by the previous owners. And yet, every time I went into the basement to do laundry or grab a box, I'd see the door, its faded paint, and the rusted lock staring back at me, as if it were waiting for something. I could never shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting. But life, as it always does, continued on. The days turned into weeks, and I found myself falling into the rhythm of small-town life. I'd wake up early, write for hours in the mornings, grab lunch at the cafe, then return home to continue unpacking or exploring. The house, despite the odd locked door, felt like it could be home. The strange feeling I had when I first noticed the door slowly faded as I adapted to my new life. But that was about to change. I didn't know it yet, but that door was the beginning of something that would haunt me for far longer than I could imagine. It had been about 3 weeks since I moved into the house. By now, the oddities that had initially caught my attention were beginning to blend into the background. The door in the basement still lingered in my mind from time to time, but I had pushed the curiosity aside. After all, there were more important things to focus on: work, writing, and settling into the peaceful routine of my new life. But one evening, something happened that shattered that calm facade, setting the wheels of unease in motion. It was a quiet night, typical of the small town, and I had just finished writing for the day. The clock on the wall read 9:15 p.m. as I stretched, feeling the familiar aches from hours spent hunched over my desk. I was in the living room, sprawled across the couch, trying to shake off the tension in my shoulders when I heard the sound. At first, it was subtle, a soft thud, the kind of noise you might dismiss as the house settling, the natural creaks and groans of an old structure. But then it came again, louder, this time a deliberate sound, almost like something heavy being dropped on the floor. I sat up, glancing toward the direction of the basement stairs. My heart rate quickened, not from fear, but from an inexplicable sense of discomfort. I had been hearing strange noises for a few days, faint whispers of movement in the walls, the occasional scraping sound in the middle of the night, but I had always written them off as normal sounds in an old house. But this felt different. It wasn't just the house settling. This was something intentional. I got up from the couch and walked slowly toward the stairs, the creaking of the floorboards underfoot making the silence even more pronounced. I stopped at the top of the stairs leading down into the basement. The door was at the bottom of the stairs, still locked as it had been when I first moved in. The air felt cooler as I stood there, an unusual chill that seemed to seep into my bones despite the warmth of the house. I hesitated. It would have been easy to brush this off, just another strange noise that had no real explanation. But something in my gut told me it was more than that. There was an odd pressure building in the air, like something was waiting for me to make a move. I looked down at the door. The lock was still there, the same rusted, old brass lock that had been there when I first arrived. The door remained shut. But then I noticed something else. There was a faint light coming from under the door. Just a thin sliver of light, barely visible in the darkness of the basement, but enough to make my stomach twist. I took a step forward, my breath catching in my throat. How could there be light coming from under the door? I knew for a fact that the basement had no windows, and I had never plugged in any lamps down there. It was impossible. I stood frozen, staring at the thin sliver of light, my mind racing. I wasn't sure what to think. Part of me wanted to run away, to ignore it and pretend it was nothing. But another part of me, something deeper, darker, felt compelled to investigate. I couldn't explain why, but the pull toward that locked door was almost magnetic. Without thinking, I stepped down the stairs. My feet were heavy, each step feeling like 100-pound weight pressing against me. When I reached the door, I stood there for a moment, staring at the light that seemed to come from nowhere. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached out and placed my hand on the cold metal of the lock. It was just as I had left it, secure, unyielding. I tried the door handle, half expecting it to open with ease, but it didn't budge. It wasn't as if I had any real reason to believe it would after all. I had seen that lock up close before, but the thought that something on the other side might be different sent a shiver up my spine. I pulled my hand away from the door, feeling a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. I was no closer to understanding what was going on, and yet the feeling that I had to know more only intensified. I stood there for a while, staring at the door, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The light had vanished by the time I looked again. There was nothing now but the familiar darkness of the basement. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That presence I'd felt earlier, that nagging sensation that had been following me around since I moved in, was now louder, more pronounced. I hurried back upstairs and closed the door behind me, though the weight in my chest didn't lift. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. The next few days passed without incident. I stayed busy, focusing on my work and trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that hung in the air. But the strange occurrences continued, noises in the night, the creaking of the floorboards when I was alone. The light under the door never returned, but I couldn't shake the memory of it. And every time I went down to the basement, I couldn't help but glance at that door, half expecting it to open on its own. Then came the second incident. One morning, I went down to the basement to get some old boxes. As I stepped into the dark, cool space, I noticed something odd, a faint smell. It was difficult to place at first, but it was there, lingering in the air. It was musty, yes, but there was something else, something sickly. It made my stomach turn. I scanned the room quickly, my eyes landing on the locked door once again. But this time, it was different. The floor around the door was wet, as though something had been spilled. But there was no sign of any liquid, no sign of anything that could have caused it. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and that instinct, that sharp, persistent feeling, told me that something was wrong. But what? The house? The door? Or was it me? I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to go upstairs, forget I had ever seen the damn floor, and move on. But I couldn't. My curiosity was getting the best of me. I bent down to inspect the wet spot, running my fingers lightly over the floor. The dampness felt strange, almost unnatural, and I quickly stood up, wiping my hand on my pants. Something about it felt off, as if the moisture shouldn't have been there at all. But I had no explanation. There was no leak, no pipes that could have burst. Just the strange, unsettling wetness that had appeared overnight. That was when I made my decision. I had to know what was behind that door. I didn't know why, but I felt as though it was the only way to put my mind at ease. And so, despite my growing unease, I began searching for a way to open the door. The weeks following my decision to investigate the locked basement door felt like a slow descent into madness. The strange occurrences had become more frequent, and with each passing day, the tension in the house seemed to mount. It wasn't just the noises or the damp spots on the floor anymore. It was a constant, unrelenting presence and awareness that something wasn't right, but not knowing what or why. The first thing I noticed was the air in the house. It had changed. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The house, which had once felt like a peaceful sanctuary, now felt heavy, like the walls were closing in. The temperature fluctuated erratically. One moment, it was unbearably hot, and the next, I'd find myself reaching for a jacket as an icy draft swept through the rooms. It was always the same rooms, the living room and the hallway near the stairs to the basement. It was as if the cold air had a mind of its own, creeping in when I was most vulnerable, when I least expected it. One morning, I woke up with a distinct feeling that I hadn't been alone during the night. The hairs on my arms stood up as I walked through the house, inspecting each room, but I couldn't find anything out of place. Yet, there was an unmistakable sense of being watched. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't just fear, it was something more primal. Something that gnawed at the edges of my consciousness, like the sensation of being followed. I decided to ignore it, telling myself that I was imagining things. That was until the first truly terrifying event. It happened late one night. I had been sitting in the living room, finishing up some work, when I heard a loud bang from downstairs. I froze, staring at the hallway that led to the basement stairs. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood up slowly, my heart racing, and walked toward the stairs. As I descended, I felt the unmistakable cold air rush up to meet me. It was like walking through a thick fog that wrapped around me, seeping into my skin. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath in front of me. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the house was still, too still. But then I noticed something I hadn't before. The basement door was slightly ajar. Just a crack, barely wide enough for my fingers to slip through. My heart hammered in my chest as I stood there, staring at it. How? I had checked that door before, and it had been locked. How could it be open now? I moved closer, each step feeling like an eternity. My fingers brushed the cold metal of the doorknob, and I tried to push the door further open. It resisted, as if something was pressing against it from the other side. I shoved harder, my breath quickening, and finally the door creaked open, revealing the darkness beyond. I flicked on the light switch, but the bulb flickered and buzzed, casting long, erratic shadows across the room. It was only then that I noticed the smell of strong, rancid odor that made my stomach churn. It was the same smell I had noticed before in the basement, only stronger now. It was like decay, like something old and rotten was hidden somewhere in the dark corners of the basement. The room was unchanged, but I felt different, like the air itself was thick with something I couldn't quite grasp. I slowly stepped into the basement, my footsteps muffled by the concrete floor. The walls, covered in damp patches, seemed to close in on me. The faint smell of mold and mildew mixed with the overpowering stench that seemed to emanate from the farthest corner of the room. I couldn't see anything in the darkness beyond the dim light, but I knew something was there. Something was watching me. The air was unnaturally still, and even the faint hum of the household pipes seemed to disappear as I moved deeper into the basement. It was then that I saw it. A shadow darting quickly across the far wall. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing. Only the darkness. My breath caught in my chest as I stood there, paralyzed, unable to move. I didn't want to look, didn't want to know what I had just seen. But I had to. I had to understand. I took a step forward, my legs trembling, and as I did, I heard the sound again, the soft scrape of something moving across the floor. It was coming from the farthest corner of the basement, near the furnace. I took another step, and then another, until I stood at the edge of the room, my hand gripping the light switch, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And then I saw it again, a figure, hunched and disfigured, crouching in the corner of the room. It was barely visible, its form twisting and contorting in ways that didn't make sense. I couldn't make out any details. The figure was too shadowy, too distorted, but I could feel it. It was alive. It was watching me. I screamed, stumbling backward, my heart pounding in my ears. My mind screamed at me to run, to leave, but my body refused to obey. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the corner. I didn't want to, but I couldn't help it. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The basement was silent once again, save for my heavy breathing. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the figure to return, but it never did. I rushed back upstairs, slamming the door behind me, my pulse still racing. My thoughts were a blur. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination brought on by exhaustion and stress. But I knew better. Deep down, I knew that what I had seen was real. Whatever was down there, whatever was behind that locked door, it was not something I could explain away. In the following days, the occurrences became even more intense. I'd hear footsteps behind me when no one was around, and I'd wake up to find items out of place. Small things, like the remote or a book I'd left on the table, moved just enough to be unsettling. There was always a presence in the house, a constant weight in the air, like I was being followed. I couldn't escape it. And then there was the noise. At night, I'd hear it again, the soft scrape of something moving across the floor in the basement. But this time, I couldn't ignore it. I had to know what was happening. I had to know what I was dealing with. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the stairs again, my hands trembling with fear. The basement door was closed, just as I had left it, but I could still feel the cold air creeping up from the bottom. The smell was worse now, almost suffocating. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and opened the door. This time, I wasn't alone. The figure was waiting for me, I didn't see it at first. I only felt it. That presence. That all-encompassing darkness. But then I heard it, an unmistakable sound. A low, guttural growl that reverberated through my bones. The flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I saw it. Its eyes. The terror I felt at that moment is impossible to describe. But what I saw in those eyes, what I felt in that basement, was something no one should ever experience. The basement door slammed shut behind me, my body trembling with fear as the shadow I had seen before seemed to materialize in the dim light. The growl that had reverberated through the air was still echoing in my mind. My heart was a drum in my chest, thumping so loudly that it felt as if the very walls could hear it. I had no choice now. I was trapped. Whatever was in that basement, whatever I had been too afraid to confront, was now standing in front of me, and I had to face it. The flashlight flickered one last time before dying completely, leaving me in total darkness. I cursed under my breath, fumbling for my phone in my pocket, my hands slick with sweat. My fingers shook so violently that I could barely hold it still long enough to turn on the flashlight. When the faint beam of light finally illuminated the room, I was met with the most horrifying sight I had ever seen. There, in the farthest corner of the basement, was the thing, the figure. But it was no longer just a shadow. It was real. It had form. And it was slowly moving toward me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I thought I might faint. I couldn't look away from it. I couldn't even blink. Its face was distorted, not human, too many features crammed into a grotesque mask. Its eyes, wide and hollow, seemed to stare right into me, but they weren't eyes at all. They were empty voids, pits of darkness that absorbed all light, all hope, all reason. I felt my legs buckle under me, but I refused to fall. I had to stay standing. The thing, it wasn't just watching me. It was waiting for something. It was waiting for me to make the first move, to make the wrong move. And when I did, I would never leave this house. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. How had it come to this? What had I gotten myself into? This wasn't just some prank or figment of my imagination. This was something real, something ancient, something that shouldn't exist in this world, yet it was here. It was in my house, and it wanted me. For a moment, I considered running. But where would I go? The house was too old, the doors too far, and the shadows too long. No matter where I went, it would find me. It would follow me. And then I would be lost forever. The floor beneath me creaked loudly, breaking the silence and sending a fresh wave of fear through my veins. I staggered backward, barely catching myself on the railing of the stairs. I needed to think. I needed to do something. But everything about this place, about the thing in front of me, was designed to strip me of my rationality. My mind was unraveling as I stared at it. The world outside of the basement felt like a distant memory, like something I had once known but could no longer touch. The air around me was so thick it felt like I was suffocating. Then, a sound broke through the tension, a scraping noise, slow and deliberate. It wasn't coming from the thing. It was coming from behind me. Slowly, I turned my head, my breath catching as I realized the door to the basement, the very door I had closed behind me, was now wide open. I hadn't heard it. I hadn't seen it move. But there it was, gaping open as if inviting something to enter or something to escape. I felt a chill spread through my body, a cold, crawling dread that was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just the figure anymore. It wasn't just the cold spots or the strange noises. This was something deeper, something far older and more terrifying than I had ever imagined. The figure in front of me moved then. It didn't walk. It didn't crawl. It slithered like something not meant to walk at all. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its joints bending at impossible angles. It glided across the floor, its movements jagged and unnatural, but there was a sickening grace to it, like a predator toying with its prey. Every second felt like an eternity, and I couldn't bring myself to look away from its grotesque form. And then, in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, but a feeling deep in my chest, it spoke to me. I couldn't understand the words. It was more like a presence, a wave of sound that passed through my body, vibrating in my bones. But the meaning was clear. It wanted me. It needed me. A sharp, sudden pain ripped through my head. My vision blurred, and I stumbled forward, my hand pressing against the cold wall for support. I could barely stand. My legs were numb, my heart racing, and everything felt like it was closing in on me. Then, the thing in front of me let out a sound, a shriek, a wail, something that could only be described as pure, unfiltered anguish. It was a sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life. A cry of agony that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. I covered my ears, but the noise was inside my mind now. It was too loud, too real, and I couldn't escape it. And then, it happened. The basement door slammed shut again, but this time there was no sound. No creak, no bang. It just vanished, as if it had never been there at all. I turned around in a panic, looking for an exit, but the basement had changed. The room that had been behind me was now gone. There were no walls, no ceiling, only the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. My pulse hammered in my ears as I realized the truth. The basement wasn't a room anymore. It was a place that existed outside of time and space. A place that wasn't bound by the laws of the world I knew. And I was trapped inside it. For the first time since I'd moved into the house, I truly understood the locked door. It wasn't just a door. It was a boundary, a threshold, a way to keep whatever was in that basement contained, locked away, hidden from the world. And somehow, I had broken it. I had opened the door, and now there was no going back. The thing reached for me, its fingers long and thin, each one ending in a sharp, bone-like nail. Its hand was mere inches from my face when I felt the air shift again. Something changed. A force beyond my understanding seemed to rise up inside me. I could hear the low hum of something powerful. My body, still shaking with fear, responded to it instinctively, violently. I don't know what happened next. One moment, I was standing there, frozen in terror, and the next, I was outside. On the porch. The night air was cold against my skin, and my house stood in front of me, silent and dark. I had no idea how I got there, but I was free. Or so I thought. The house is still there, and so is the locked door, but I can't go back. I can't ever go back. I never truly left the house, not in the way I thought I would. Sure, I stepped out onto that porch, breathing in the cold night air like it could wash away the terror that had clung to me in the basement, but the fear, the heavy feeling that something was still watching, still waiting, it stayed with me. And it wasn't just the fear of the house. It was the feeling of being trapped inside my own mind. Trapped in a place that didn't want me to leave. I had escaped the basement, but I wasn't sure if I had really escaped at all. I spent the first few days in a daze. I didn't know where to go or who to turn to. I called a few people, trying to explain what had happened, but how do you describe something like that? How do you explain seeing something that wasn't supposed to be real? I knew that if I told anyone, if I said the words out loud, I would sound crazy. So I didn't. I kept it to myself. I couldn't bring myself to go back into the house, though. The fear still clung to me like a shadow, and I knew that if I stepped back inside, I would only be pulling myself into something far worse. The basement door, that locked door, was still there. And it wasn't just the door. It was the thing that waited behind it. the thing I had barely managed to escape. It wasn't long before I decided that I needed to take action. I needed answers. I needed to know what was going on, what had happened to me. I had no choice but to return to the house, to face whatever it was that had terrified me. There was no other way. I knew I couldn't go back alone, though. I wasn't foolish enough to think I could face this by myself again. So I contacted a local historian, someone who might know about the house, about the land it sat on, about any strange occurrences in the area. I didn't tell him the full truth. I couldn't. But I asked enough questions to make him interested. He agreed to meet me at the house a week later. When the day arrived, I drove there with a mixture of dread and determination. The house still loomed at the end of the street, its old windows staring blankly at me. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, breathing in the air. The whole place felt wrong, like I was intruding, like I wasn't supposed to be there. The historian arrived shortly after. He was an older man with graying hair and sharp, knowing eyes. He didn't seem frightened by the house. He walked toward it with a calmness that I could never hope to replicate. I followed him up the steps, feeling a strange mix of fear and anticipation. Inside, nothing had changed. The air still carried the same weight, the same oppressive feeling that had made my skin crawl weeks earlier. We moved through the house in silence, each step heavier than the last. I didn't want to speak. I didn't know what to say. The man, though, seemed unfazed. He moved like he knew what he was looking for. We made our way to the basement. I watched as he examined the door, the same door I had shut so quickly in my haste to escape. He didn't flinch. He didn't even seem surprised by it. "You felt it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice calm, measured. "The weight in the air. The pressure. It's not your imagination." I nodded, suddenly feeling less like I was going mad and more like I was simply in over my head. He reached out, running his fingers along the edge of the door. "There's a reason this house has been here so long. It's not just the structure. It's what's beneath it." His words hung in the air as he turned to me, his face serious. "This house sits on land that was once home to an old ritual site, a place where dark forces were summoned. Those who lived here before knew of it, but they didn't understand what they were dealing with. Over the years, whatever they awakened below this house has only grown stronger." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as he spoke. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "It's not just one thing. It's an entity, something old, something that was meant to be locked away. What you saw, that's the result of a ritual gone wrong. The locked door you found, it's a containment, keeping whatever's inside from breaking free." I had no words, no response. All I could do was stare at the door, as if the answer could somehow materialize if I focused hard enough. But it didn't. The historian seemed to sense my fear, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of concern in his eyes. "The truth is," he continued, "you've opened something that wasn't meant to be opened, and it won't let you leave until it gets what it wants." I shook my head, trying to dismiss his words, trying to believe that there was some other explanation. But deep down, I knew. I knew that the thing I had seen in that basement was real. The thing that had waited behind the door wasn't just a trick of the mind. It was something more. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The historian paused, then gave me a look that I'll never forget. A look of both sympathy and resignation. "We can't stop it. Not now. Not anymore." We stood there for what felt like hours, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I couldn't bring myself to speak again. All I could do was feel the weight of his words sink in. The truth was inescapable. I had opened the door, and now, whatever was inside, whatever I had let loose, would follow me. The man left soon after. He didn't offer any solutions. He didn't offer any comfort. He simply left me with the knowledge that the house was never meant to be disturbed. And now that I had disturbed it, there was no going back. I stayed in the house for a few more days. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I just waited. Waited for the thing in the basement to return. Waited for it to find me again, but it never did. When I finally left, I didn't take anything with me. I left the house behind, and with it, the nightmare that had taken root in my mind. But I know it's still there. I know that it hasn't forgotten me. Because when I close my eyes, when I lie awake in the dark, I can feel it. Watching, waiting. And sometimes, I swear, I hear the sound of the basement door creaking open, just a little. The house might be empty, but I know the truth. The door will never be locked again. The days that followed felt like a blur. I don't know if it was the trauma of what I had gone through, or if the house itself had somehow infected me, but everything seemed distant, as if I were floating just outside my own life. I left the town. I left the house. But the memories, the images, they stayed with me, as if they had become a part of who I was. It didn't matter where I went or how far I ran. It was always there, gnawing at the back of my mind. I tried to forget. I tried to fill the space in my mind with new memories, with the normalcy of life. But the feeling that something was still following me never left. It wasn't a fear of the house, or of the locked door, or of the thing behind it. No, it was a different kind of fear, a fear of myself. A fear that I was never truly free. That the moment I had opened that door, I had unleashed something far worse than I could ever understand. The house, now abandoned, stood at the edge of town, just like it always had. It seemed so ordinary from the outside. If you were to drive by it, you would never suspect the horrors it held within. But I knew better. The house wasn't just a house anymore. It was a place where the past and the present collided. It was a place where dark forces were never meant to be disturbed, and I had disturbed them. I never went back, never even looked at it again. But there are nights, in the silence of my own home, when I still feel it. The weight of the thing that I released. It lingers in the dark corners of my room, just out of sight. And no matter how many doors I close, how many locks I turn, I can't shake the feeling that something is always just behind me. Watching, waiting. It's not just the house that haunts me. It's the knowledge that whatever was behind that door, whatever it was I saw, is still out there. I don't know if it's still in the house, or if it's followed me. I don't know if it's still waiting for me to return, or if it's already claimed another victim. But I know this. It never stops. It doesn't matter how far I run, how much time passes. The thing behind that door, the thing I let out, it's never far behind. It's like a shadow. It follows me wherever I go, and there's no escaping it. I can't tell anyone what happened, not in a way that they would understand. The few I tried to tell looked at me like I was crazy. Even the historian, who seemed to know so much about the house, couldn't offer me any answers. I'm not even sure if he believed it himself. But that's the thing about fear, isn't it? It doesn't need to make sense. It doesn't need to be logical. It just is. As much as I want to forget, as much as I want to move on, I can't. Because the truth is, I'll never truly be free of it. No matter how many doors I close, how many locks I turn, how many miles I put between myself and that place, the door will never be locked again. The thing I released is still there, out there, waiting. And sometimes, just sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear it. The faintest sound, the creaking of a door, just a little bit. Open. Let me take you back to a summer that should have been like any other, back when everything in my life seemed normal. It was the kind of time where the biggest worry was finishing homework or figuring out where to hang out on the weekends. I was a college student, still fresh in my second year. living in a shared apartment with a couple of friends. The year was drawing to a close, and like most of the world, I was ready for a break from the usual hustle. My friends and I were planning something different this time, a weekend getaway to a place I hadn't seen in years. We had been talking about it for weeks, joking around about how we needed a little adventure. I hadn't been back to the countryside where I grew up in a long time, and I had always liked the idea of exploring abandoned places. We were a close-knit group, always in search of something new, and this time we decided to visit an old farmhouse that had been the subject of local rumors for years. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. Some people claimed that strange things happened around there, others said it was just the usual small-town gossip. There were 4 of us: me, Dean, Greg, and Mike. Dean was the practical one, always trying to keep things grounded. He would always be the first to remind us not to do anything stupid, but his curiosity was just as strong as the rest of ours. Greg was the daredevil. If there was something creepy, Greg was the first one to want to check it out, and he wasn't afraid to push everyone else to go along. Mike, on the other hand, was the quiet one. He didn't say much, but when he did, it often carried weight. I would describe myself as somewhere in between curious but cautious, trying to balance out the mix of personalities. On the day we decided to go, the air felt heavier than usual. It was one of those summer afternoons where the heat seemed to just hang in the air, not moving at all. It was a perfect day to head out of town, to leave behind the noise and clutter of the city, even if it was just for a little while. We packed up Greg's old Jeep with a few bags, some snacks, and drinks for the road. It wasn't much, but we figured it would be enough. The old farmhouse wasn't that far away, just about an hour's drive from where we were staying. I remember the way the drive felt. The further we went, the quieter it got. The city noise faded behind us, replaced by the sound of tires on gravel roads, the wind whipping through the trees. The countryside was beautiful, no doubt, but there was something unsettling about how isolated it was. No houses for miles, just empty fields stretching out in every direction. When we finally reached the farmhouse, it stood there like a forgotten monument to the past. The wooden structure was weathered, its paint peeling in strips. The roof sagged in places, and the windows, once clear, were now coated in grime, obscuring whatever may have been inside. From a distance, it looked like a picture from an old history book or remnant of a different time. It was clear no one had lived there for decades, yet somehow it still felt alive. Not in the way a house filled with people would feel, but more like it had a presence of its own, one that didn't quite belong to the world outside. We parked the Jeep at the edge of the property and got out, stretching our legs after the long drive. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the land. The wind had picked up, and I remember how it seemed to moan through the trees, making the branches sway in odd ways. But no one said anything about it. We all joked about how creepy the place looked, laughing it off, but I couldn't help but feel a strange unease creeping up my spine. I've always had a thing for old, abandoned places, but this one felt different. Something was off, even though I couldn't put my finger on it. "Let's just check it out," Greg said, already moving toward the front door. "It'll be fun." Mike didn't say anything, just followed silently behind Greg. Dean hesitated for a moment before shrugging and walking up with him. I stood there for a second longer, looking at the house. For some reason, I was hesitant, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed the others as they made their way up the creaky front steps. The door was ajar, just slightly, and it creaked in protest as Greg pushed it open. The smell of mildew and dust hit us as we stepped inside, and the air felt cool compared to the heat outside. The inside was dim, the only light coming from the faint glow of the setting sun filtering through the grimy windows. There was a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of our footsteps as we moved deeper into the house. The first room we entered was a living room, though it barely resembled one. The furniture was covered in thick layers of dust, and the floorboards groaned under our weight. Broken glass littered the floor, remnants of what might have been a mirror or picture frame. The wallpaper, once likely bright, had long since faded to a dull, peeling pattern. As we explored further, I began to feel the weight of the place. It wasn't just the abandonment or the dust, it was something else, something unspoken. The house felt wrong, like it had been forgotten for a reason, but we were too intrigued to leave just yet. We didn't talk much as we moved through the rooms, our footsteps echoing off the walls, the house holding on to its secrets as we slowly uncovered them. None of us said anything about how we felt, but we all knew. There was something waiting in this house, something we hadn't yet discovered. And that's when the first strange thing happened. The house was silent, too silent for comfort. The only sounds were the occasional creaks of the floorboards beneath our feet and the distant wind howling through the gaps in the broken windows. There was something about the stillness of the place that didn't sit right with me. It felt like it was holding its breath, as if waiting for something. But we pushed on, moving from room to room, finding little more than dust and decay. Greg was leading the way, of course, always a step ahead, already peering into the next room, pushing open doors that had likely been closed for years. His enthusiasm didn't waver, but I could see a flicker of something in his eyes, something that wasn't quite the excitement I was used to. It was like he was hungry for something, even though I couldn't tell what. Mike was just behind him, walking with his usual quiet, contemplative stride. He never rushed, never seemed to be too eager to get anywhere, but it was in his nature to follow wherever the group went. Dean was trailing last, occasionally checking his phone as if he were unsure whether we were being reckless or whether he was just trying to stay connected to something outside this forgotten house. It wasn't long before we stumbled across something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We had found a narrow staircase leading to what I assumed was the basement. The wooden steps were worn, creaking under our weight. Greg, ever the adventurer, took the first step down, and we followed hesitantly. The stairs had an unnatural dampness to them, and the air smelled musty, like wet earth and old stone. The basement, when we reached it, was even worse than I'd imagined. It was dark, save for the faint light streaming through the cracked windows at ground level, and the stone walls looked as if they were slowly closing in. There was an old, rusty furnace in one corner, a couple of broken chairs scattered around, and an assortment of rotting boxes piled up against the walls. It looked like a place no one had dared to enter for decades. We were exploring in silence, walking cautiously over the uneven floor, when something caught my attention. There was a low hum, a faint buzzing sound, coming from the far corner of the basement. I stopped dead in my tracks. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. Dean, who had been right behind me, paused, listening. Greg, of course, didn't seem bothered, but Mike's eyes darted over toward the noise. "It's probably just a broken pipe or something," Greg said, trying to shrug it off. But there was a hint of unease in his voice, too. I wasn't sure if it was just my imagination, but I could have sworn the hum seemed to grow louder, more insistent. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse, almost like an electrical current running through the walls. "I don't like it," Mike finally said, his voice low, almost inaudible, but it sent a chill down my spine. Mike was the least likely to say something unless he really felt it, and hearing him voice his discomfort made me uneasy. Dean gave Greg a pointed look. "Maybe we should go. It's getting late, and we haven't even checked the rest of the house." Greg shook his head. "We're fine. We're just hearing things." But even as he said it, his tone was different, less confident. I could tell that even Greg, the one who always pushed us into doing things we shouldn't, was starting to feel the weight of the house presence. The hum, whatever it was, wasn't letting up, I'm telling you, we need to go, Dean insisted, his voice tight. There was a brief silence before Greg relented, reluctantly turning to head back toward the stairs. But as he took a step, the hum stopped abruptly, and in its place was the sound of something scraping. It was faint at first, just a soft scrape on the floor, but it grew louder, the sound dragging like metal against stone. We all froze. Mike's head whipped around to face the direction of the noise, and Dean stepped back instinctively, looking for the source. But there was nothing to see. The basement was empty, the walls bare except for the old furnace and scattered debris. Greg's eyes widened. What the hell was that? I told you, Dean muttered under his breath. But Greg wasn't about to back down now. He took a few tentative steps forward, and I followed. The scraping continued, and we all felt that growing sense of unease. As we moved closer to the far corner, the scraping stopped, replaced by the sound of what seemed like breathing. It was a slow, labored breath, heavy, almost as if it was coming from deep within the walls themselves. The temperature in the basement dropped, and I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. I looked around, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. Just the old furnace, the boxes, and the dark corners of the room. What the hell is that? Greg's voice trembled now, the bravado gone. I could tell he was no longer as confident as he had been earlier. Whatever was happening, whatever we were hearing, it wasn't something we could explain away. We need to leave. Now, Mike said firmly, his voice carrying a tone I'd never heard before. Dean was already moving toward the stairs, but Greg stopped him. Hold on, I need to see what's down here. It's not just. But before he could finish, the noise came again. This time, it wasn't just scraping or breathing. There was a low growl, deep and guttural, like an animal that had been hidden for far too long. It echoed through the basement, vibrating in my chest. Greg turned sharply, his face pale. That's it. I'm done. We all rushed up the stairs in a panic, Greg in the lead, and I could feel the sense of urgency in every movement, every glance. As we reached the top of the stairs, I heard a loud bang coming from the basement, like something heavy had been thrown across the room. We bolted for the front door, our feet pounding against the wooden floors. When we finally made it outside, the air felt different, like we had left something behind in that house. I could still hear the faint hum in my ears, lingering like a distant memory. We didn't speak as we piled into the Jeep, slamming the doors shut. The engine roared to life, and without a word, Greg slammed the gear shift into drive. The farmhouse quickly disappeared in the rearview mirror, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been down there, whatever we had disturbed, hadn't left with us. Something was waiting, and somehow I knew it wasn't finished with us yet. We didn't go back to the farmhouse that night. As soon as we were out of sight, the dread that had gripped us started to settle in. For hours, we sat in silence, parked by the side of the road, the headlights of Greg's Jeep casting long shadows in the dark. It was like the moment we left that place, the air around us grew heavier, thicker with something unspoken. I could feel it, like an oppressive weight on my chest. We hadn't even exchanged more than a few words since we left. Greg kept staring ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Mike, who was usually quiet, looked like he was on edge. He kept glancing at the road, the trees, anything to distract himself from the feeling that was creeping up on him, just like it was creeping up on all of us. Dean was the only one who spoke up. I told you it wasn't just an old house. There's something wrong with that place. It's not just dust and rust. It's... Dean trailed off, shaking his head. None of us argued with him. Not this time. But when we finally got back to town, when we were all tucked safely in our own beds, the images from the farmhouse stayed with me. The dark, narrow staircase. The sound of scraping metal. That breathing. I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't left everything behind when we drove away. Something had followed us, something that had been waiting all along. The next morning was when things started to get even worse. It began with Greg. I was the first to get a text from him, a single line that made my stomach drop. I saw it. At first, I thought he was just messing around. I'd barely gotten any sleep, and I didn't have the energy to read too much into his words. But then another text followed, and this one was different. I don't know how to explain it, but I saw it outside my window. It was standing in the trees. I swear to God, it was watching me. I didn't respond right away. My heart started racing, and I couldn't get the images of the farmhouse out of my mind. I couldn't help but think about the growl we'd heard, the suffocating darkness in that basement. Had whatever was there followed us home? Was that even possible? I texted Mike and Dean. Greg had been our leader, the one who pushed us forward, but now he seemed like he was unraveling, like whatever had been in that house was crawling under his skin too. Mike's reply was short, sharp. I don't think we should go back. Ever. Dean, on the other hand, was the one who suggested something that made my blood run cold. We need to go back. We need to see what's really going on. And just like that, the cycle began again. Greg wanted to confront whatever had been haunting him. Dean, with his unshakable curiosity, was in. Mike and I weren't so sure, but we couldn't back out now. It was that afternoon when we found ourselves back at the farmhouse, parked along the same overgrown driveway, our tires crunching over the gravel in eerie synchrony. The sky was overcast, the clouds heavy and pregnant with rain, but there was no thunder, no storm. Just that heavy, oppressive silence. As we stood in front of the house, the door was ajar, as though it had been waiting for us. But this time, there was something different. The air felt colder, somehow. Not just colder than it should have been for a summer afternoon, but colder in a way that made my breath catch. The kind of cold that made your spine tingle. We stepped inside, but the house didn't feel the same. It felt even more like it was alive. The floorboards creaked in a way that made me think they were moving on their own, shifting beneath our feet. It was almost like the house itself was breathing, sighing, shifting with us. It was Greg who spoke first. I don't know why, but it feels like it's waiting for us. And that was when it started. The small things, the things that didn't seem like much at first, began happening again, but this time they were more frequent, more intense. We were in the living room, standing in a circle, when the temperature dropped so suddenly that we could see our breath. No one said anything at first. It wasn't until a faint scraping sound echoed from the hallway that we all stiffened. "Not again," Mike muttered under his breath, the words barely audible. Dean, however, was already walking toward the sound. His feet were light, his movements almost too deliberate. It was like he wasn't just investigating, he was chasing it. "This is it," he said, a strange gleam in his eye. I followed him down the hallway, Greg right behind me. We reached the end of the hall, where a door had been shut, and I don't know why, but the urge to open it, to see what was behind it, consumed me. My hand reached for the knob, and it turned with an eerie ease, the wood creaking in protest. But what we found wasn't what I expected. The room was dark, but there was a faint glow coming from the corner. I couldn't make sense of it at first, but as I stepped closer, I realized what it was: old photographs spread out across the floor. They were framed, dusty, but the edges were still crisp. Greg crouched down to pick one up, but the moment his fingers touched it, something shifted in the room. The air became thick, dense. There was no wind, but the room seemed to sway, as if it were on the edge of collapsing. The photos, once still, now fluttered like they were alive, their edges bending and curling in unnatural ways. "What the hell is this?" Greg whispered, And then, as if in response, the lights flickered and went out. Complete darkness swallowed us whole. "Stay close," Mike said, his voice shaking. His hand brushed mine, and I could feel his heartbeat thumping against my arm. In the dark, we heard its footsteps. Soft, deliberate, moving just out of sight. They were coming closer, getting louder. Someone or something was in the house with us, moving through the shadows. We fumbled for our phones, their screens barely lighting the pitch-black room, but it didn't help. The footsteps came from all directions now, circling us, closing in. We couldn't tell if it was something alive or something from beyond the grave. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, but we were too deep in now. "Turn on your flashlights," Greg ordered, his voice strained. The beams of light cut through the dark, but nothing was there. The room was empty, except for the photos scattered across the floor. But the sensation of being watched, of being trapped, was unmistakable. We moved cautiously, trying to find a way out. But every corner we turned, the atmosphere grew heavier, the walls seeming to close in tighter around us. The sense of being surrounded by something we couldn't see was overwhelming. The room felt smaller with every passing second, as if the house itself was slowly pressing in on us, pushing us closer to whatever was lurking just beyond our reach. The tension was unbearable. My heart was pounding in my chest. And then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind us with a force that rattled the walls. We were locked inside. Panic set in, and for a moment, none of us could think clearly. The door wouldn't budge. I pounded on the wood with my fists, but it was like the house was refusing to let us leave. We were trapped. I don't know how much time passed before the door finally creaked open again, but when it did, there was no longer any sound. No scraping, no footsteps, no growling. Just silence. But it wasn't the same silence we'd walked in on. It was cold, final. And as we stumbled out into the hall, our eyes adjusting to the light, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the hallway, standing perfectly still, was a figure. No face, just a shadow, a shape that shouldn't have been there. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. We stood there, frozen. The door had closed behind us with a deafening bang, and for a moment, the world outside the farmhouse seemed a million miles away. The weight of the darkness pressing against us felt heavier, suffocating, as though we were caught in a dream from which there was no waking. The figure that had appeared in the hallway wasn't just a shadow, it was something else. Something more. I could feel my heart thumping against my chest, a frantic rhythm that mirrored the rising panic inside me. We all stood still, staring at the spot where the figure had been moments before. It was like it had never existed, like it had been a figment of my mind, except that I knew, deep down, that it wasn't. What the hell was that? Greg's voice was barely a whisper, his breath ragged. His face was pale, his usual bravado gone, replaced by something I hadn't seen before, pure fear. His eyes darted around the room, searching for answers that weren't there. Mike, who had been the most skeptical of all of us, finally broke the silence. "This is insane. This isn't real. We need to leave now." His voice trembled, something I'd never heard from him. Mike was always the calm one, the one who kept a level head in the face of chaos. But now, there was no calm, only a man on the edge of breaking down. Dean, however, wasn't ready to leave. His curiosity, his need to understand, had always been his driving force. And now, even though fear was written all over his face, he was the first to move toward the hallway again. "No, we have to figure out what's going on. It's here. It's real." His voice was strained, a mix of fear and determination. "We can't just walk away from this." I don't know why, but I followed him. Maybe I was just as curious as he was, or maybe I was too afraid to be alone. Whatever the reason, I found myself walking down the hallway again, my steps hesitant, the floorboards creaking underfoot, as if the house itself was protest our intrusion. We reached the end of the hallway, the same place where the figure had been standing. It was empty now, as if it had never been there. The silence was deafening. But beneath the silence, I could hear something, a low, guttural sound, like a hum or a growl, distant but growing louder. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Mike nodded, his face etched with concern. "What is that?" "It's coming from inside." Greg, now visibly shaking, pointed toward the basement door. "It's coming from down there." I know it. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I found myself walking toward the basement door. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around, to leave while we still could, but something inside me kept pushing forward. The door was slightly ajar, the hinges groaning in protest as I reached for the handle. As my hand closed around the cold metal, the temperature in the room dropped again, a sharp chill creeping up my spine. I felt it before I saw it, the presence. It was behind me, watching. Something was watching us. "Are you sure about this?" Mike's voice cracked. He was standing just behind me, his eyes wide, his hand outstretched like he was ready to stop me at any moment. But it was too late. I opened the door. The basement was dark, even darker than the rest of the house. The only light came from the small beam of my flashlight, cutting through the thick air. The moment I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled my bones. We were trapped again. A cold, suffocating air filled the basement, thick with the smell of mildew and decay. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. My breath came out in shallow bursts as I looked around. The basement was full of old, rotting furniture, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling, and dust that had settled into every corner. But something wasn't right. There, in the farthest corner of the basement, I saw it. A large, old chest, covered in dust and grime. But it wasn't the chest that drew my attention. It was the faint glow coming from beneath it. At first, I thought it was my flashlight playing tricks on me, but then I saw it again. A faint, eerie blue light. I was about to step closer when I heard a sound, one I'll never forget, a low, deep growl that seemed to come from all around us. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. It was something in between, something primal and ancient. We all froze, our eyes wide with terror. And that's when we saw it. From the shadows, something moved. It was slow, deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. My heart skipped a beat as I tried to focus my flashlight on the shape that was emerging from the darkness. It was tall, far too tall to be human, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally as it stepped forward. Its skin was pale, sickly, and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were black holes, devoid of any light, and as it looked at us, I felt an ice-cold terror wash over me. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, my throat constricted with the weight of pure fear. The thing in front of us tilted its head, its eyes never leaving ours. Greg was the first to speak, his voice barely a whisper. "What the hell is that?" I don't know what we were expecting, but it wasn't that. We hadn't come here for this. None of us were ready for it. But now there was no turning back. Dean, despite his fear, stepped forward, his voice trembling but defiant. "What do you want from us?" The creature didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching. It was like it was waiting for something, waiting for us to make a move. Mike stepped back, his face pale with fear. "This is it. We need to leave. Now." But the thing didn't let us go. It was as though the moment we'd entered the basement, it had sealed our fate. The air grew colder, the light from the flashlight flickering as if the very power in the room was being drained. "Run," I whispered. We didn't wait for anyone to say anything more. We turned, bolting toward the basement stairs, but as we did, we heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, following us, growing louder with every passing second. We raced up the stairs, but it was too late. The door slammed shut before we could reach it. We were trapped. And that's when the creature spoke. Its voice wasn't human. It was like 1,000 whispers wrapped into one deep, gravelly sound that seemed to reverberate through the very walls. "You shouldn't have come back." And then the darkness swallowed us whole. The basement door slammed shut behind us with a finality that echoed through the thick silence. My mind raced, trying to process everything that had just happened. The creature, its chilling presence, the growl, the feeling of being utterly powerless, was as though the entire farmhouse was alive, and it had decided that we were no longer welcome. We scrambled to the top of the stairs, adrenaline surging through our veins. My legs were shaky, my heart pounding in my chest as I reached for the door handle, only to find it locked. Come on. I tugged at the door, panic setting in as I heard the footsteps growing closer. The creature was still behind us, following our every move. We had no time. No time at all. Greg was the first to speak, his voice high-pitched with fear. "We're not getting out, are we?" I didn't want to answer. I didn't want to admit the truth. The house felt like it was closing in around us, the walls pressing tighter and tighter. The air was thick with tension, like the house itself was watching us, waiting for us to make the next move. Dean, the one who had insisted we explore, now looked just as terrified as the rest of us. "We need to find a way out. This place, it's not normal. It's not safe." His words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and for the first time since we'd arrived, I wasn't sure if leaving was even possible. We frantically searched the room, looking for anything that could help us escape. My eyes scanned the walls, the corners, the ceiling. There had to be another way out, another door, a window, something. And then, in the far corner of the room, hidden behind an old dresser, I saw it. A small, rusted metal panel. It wasn't much, but it was a glimmer of hope. My heart skipped a beat. "Over here," I shouted, running toward it. The others followed quickly, and I knelt down to inspect the panel. It was bolted shut, the hinges long since corroded by years of neglect. But it wasn't locked. I could open it. With shaking hands, I grabbed the edge of the panel and pulled. The metal screeched as it came loose, revealing a small, narrow tunnel that led into darkness. The smell of damp earth and mildew wafted up from below, and I could feel a gust of cold air rushing through the opening. This might be it," Greg said, his voice low, as though he didn't quite believe it. "We have to go now," Mike said, his voice strained, his fear palpable. "It's the only chance we have." One by one, we crawled through the opening. It was a tight fit, but we managed to squeeze through, our bodies pressing against the cold, damp walls of the narrow tunnel. The sound of the creature's footsteps faded behind us, but the fear still clung to me, a constant weight on my chest. We crawled for what felt like an eternity, the air growing thicker and colder as we moved deeper into the earth. The further we went, the more I felt like we were descending into the very bowels of the farmhouse, into something ancient and malevolent. I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature wasn't the only thing in this place, that there was something else down here, something even older, even darker. But we had no choice. We had to keep going. Finally, after what seemed like hours, we saw a faint light ahead. I pushed myself forward, eager to reach the end of the tunnel, to escape the suffocating darkness that had been closing in on us for so long. When we emerged from the tunnel, we found ourselves outside the farmhouse, bathed in the dim light of the moon. We were free. At least, that's what I thought. We stood in stunned silence for a few moments, taking in the night air, the cool breeze brushing against our faces. We had made it out. We had escaped. But the relief was short-lived. As we looked around, I realized that we were no longer in the same place we had entered. The farmhouse was no longer behind us. It was gone, vanished into the night like a mirage. In its place stood nothing but empty land, stretching out in every direction. What? What happened? Dean asked, his voice trembling with disbelief. Where's the house? It was right there, right there. We turned in every direction, trying to make sense of what we were seeing, but it was impossible. There was nothing, just a vast, empty expanse of overgrown grass and twisted trees, the kind that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. It was as if the farmhouse had never existed at all. Greg collapsed to his knees, his hands gripping his head as he let out a strangled cry. This isn't real. It can't be real. We didn't just escape. We didn't escape. We're still trapped. I couldn't argue with him. The farmhouse, the creature, everything, it felt like it had all been part of some twisted nightmare. But the terror I had felt, the fear that had gripped me in that house, was real. The marks it had left on us were real. And then, as if to confirm the nightmare wasn't over, I heard it. The low, guttural growl echoing through the night air, a sound that chilled me to my very core. We weren't free. We never had been. The growl grew louder, closer. It wasn't coming from any direction we could see. It was coming from everywhere. We ran. We didn't look back. We didn't dare. The world around us blurred as we sprinted through the overgrown grass, the sounds of footsteps behind us growing louder with every second. The growl became a roar, shaking the very earth beneath us. We could feel it closing in, hear it getting closer. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. We stopped running, gasping for breath, hearts pounding in our chests. We stood in the darkness, the air thick with tension, the silence deafening. But there was nothing there. Nothing but the darkness and the cold. We never spoke of what happened that night. Some things are too terrible to put into words. And maybe, just maybe, the farmhouse isn't done with us yet. Maybe it's waiting for us to come back, waiting for the right moment to claim us all. But one thing's for sure, we'll never forget the night we were trapped in the farmhouse. And we'll never go back. Not ever again. The events that transpired that night are still etched in my memory, vivid and unyielding, like scars that never truly heal. After we fled from the farmhouse, we thought we had escaped. But there's no real escaping a nightmare, not one that lingers in the corners of your mind, clawing at your consciousness long after you think you've left it behind. We made it back to town, bruised and shaken, and yet something about the town felt different. The faces of the people who greeted us on the street, the old brick buildings standing tall in the distance, they all seemed strangely unfamiliar. As though the night we spent in that farmhouse had changed something in us. Or maybe it had changed the world we thought we knew. We stayed together, trying to process what had happened, but words felt insufficient. No one wanted to talk about it at first. The terror, the darkness, the feeling that something had been watching us the entire time, it was just too much to bear. And so we went about our days, trying to pretend everything was normal, but I could feel the weight of it all pressing down on us. Time, however, has a way of dulling the sharp edges of trauma. Slowly, we started to move on, or so I thought. But as the weeks passed, strange things began happening again, small, subtle signs that perhaps we hadn't left the farmhouse behind after all. It started with dreams. At first, they were distant, fleeting memories of the night flashes of the creature, the growls, the feel of the cold walls pressing against us. But then the dreams grew stronger, more detailed, as if they were trying to tell me something. And in those dreams, I was always back in the farmhouse, always being hunted by that thing. I could feel its presence, just beyond my reach, always watching, always waiting. And then came the noises. At first, it was just a faint tapping, like someone knocking on the door. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination, but it didn't stop. The knocking came every night at exactly the same time, midnight. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, it became impossible to ignore the feeling that someone or something was out there. One evening, as I was walking home from work, I passed an old, dilapidated building on the outskirts of town. It was just a shadow of what it used to be, windows boarded up, the paint peeling from the walls. But there was something about it, something familiar. My heart skipped a beat, and as I took a closer look, I realized with a jolt that it was the farmhouse, or at least the ruins of it. The same worn-down structure, the same eerie sense of something being wrong. I froze, the air thick around me, and for a split second, I swore I saw a shadow move behind the broken windows, a figure watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. But the unease remained, crawling under my skin, making my pulse quicken. That night, I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that the farmhouse and the creature were nothing but a bad memory, a nightmare. But deep down, I knew the truth. It was still there. It was never gone. I met up with Greg and the others a few weeks later, hoping to put the past to rest. We gathered at a bar, sitting in a dimly lit corner, nursing drinks as we exchanged uneasy glances. None of us wanted to speak about the farmhouse, but the tension was palpable. "I've been hearing things," Greg said quietly, looking over his shoulder as though checking to see if anyone else was listening. "At night, it's like something's trying to get in. It's like it knows we're here." I didn't say anything, but the knot in my stomach tightened. I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear what he had to say next. "I went back," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I had to, I thought. I thought maybe if I went back, I could make sense of it. But it was still there. The house, the feeling. It was like everything had picked up right where we left off." He paused, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. "It's still waiting for us." The others sat in silence, but the weight of his words hung heavily in the air. I knew what he meant. It had never left us. The house, the creature, that sense of being hunted, it was part of us now, whether we wanted it to be or not. And then something strange happened. As we sat there, trying to process what Greg had said, I noticed something moving out of the corner of my eye. I turned, only to see a figure standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light outside. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I saw it more clearly. The tall, thin figure, its face obscured by the shadow, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. My heart stopped, and I felt the same dread that I had felt that night in the farmhouse, as though the figure had been following us all along, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Before I could say anything, the figure disappeared into the night as quickly as it had appeared. We sat there in stunned silence, the room suddenly feeling colder, the air heavier. "I don't know what to do anymore," I said, breaking the silence. "It's never going to stop, is it?" Dean looked at me, his expression grave. Maybe it's not supposed to stop. Maybe we're just meant to live with it. Maybe it's always been a part of us." The truth settled in like a heavy weight. We had never truly escaped. The farmhouse, the creature, it was all part of something bigger, something we could never fully understand. And as much as we wanted to walk away from it, we couldn't. It would always be with us. As the years passed, life went on. We grew older, moved away, started families, tried to put the past behind us. But the memories of that night, the sound of the growl, the feeling of being trapped, never really faded. And sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees, or when the house is silent and the night stretches out long and dark, I still hear the faintest sound of footsteps behind me, and I know that we are never truly alone. The farmhouse is still there, somewhere, just beyond the veil of the world we see. And though we may try to move on, the creature, the darkness, it waits. It waits for the right time to return, to claim us all. And so, as I sit here, years later, reflecting on everything that happened, I realized something important. Some places, some experiences, are never meant to be forgotten.